Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. The history of intertribal warfare is often, regrettably, overlooked in the scope of posterity. Though many of the conflicts went unrecorded, the stories that have survived bespeak a world awash in the chaos and violence that has engulfed every culture and society, to some extent or another, throughout world history. From the jungles of Central America, to the frigid plains of Canada, to the dense forests of the eastern seaboard, to the islands of the South Pacific, conflicts between native peoples over land, hunting grounds, natural resources, and the settlement of generations-long blood feuds have shaped the cultures, demography, and geography of countless native cultures. Tonight, History at the OK Corral brings you 15 tales of some of the most brutal and consequential battles in the global history of intertribal warfare.
October 1870, near present-day Saskatchewan, Alberta. A large party of Cree, young dogs, and Salto had been making their way southeast for a few days. Anywhere from 600 to 800 strong, they were on the warpath in hopes of exacting revenge on their hated rivals, the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot had been wreaking havoc on the Cree for generations, but in the last few months had been particularly frequent in their raiding. However, these incessant minor raids were largely because the Blackfoot had been severely weakened by a smallpox outbreak over the last 2 years, and were having trouble securing resources via any more grandiose means. So, now, the chiefs of the Cree concluded that this would be a good time to make their assault. But, on this chilly morning in the middle of the Albertan plains, several dozen warriors stood in a semicircle around the war chief Piapo. Piapo had had a dream, and the dream had given him great concern about proceeding. As the impatient party of young warriors stood skeptically listening to his recounting of the dream, he beseeched them to proceed no farther on this raid. He proclaimed he had seen a giant buffalo with iron horns in his dream, and that this buffalo was attacking their entire camp, mauling and killing them wholesale with its giant iron horns. Understandably, Piapo thought this was not the kind of omen one wants to encounter while on the warpath. Still though, while dreams and visions did indeed hold great sway within the Cree tribe, this did not mean that all visions were created equal, nor that all were to be taken seriously. This party of bellicose young men were intent on exacting their revenge for horses stolen and family members killed. Thus, they were not terribly inclined to turn around and head home just because one of them had essentially had a bad dream. The party ignored his warnings, and they all carried on, southeast towards what is today known as the Oldman River, near present-day Lethbridge, Alberta. This is where the Blackfoot and their allies, the Bloods, were camped. Now, before we get too much further into this story, it's worth taking a moment to clarify the alliances between these different tribes that resulted in these deeply held and decades-long blood feuds. Like almost any other tribes cohabitating in a particular region, strategic alliances were often formed on Canada's harsh Central Plains as a means of survival. The Blackfoot were the largest contingent of the Blackfoot Confederacy. They were comprised of the Siksika, the Blackfoot, the Kainai, or the Blood, and two sections of the Piegan, or Piikani, the Northern Piikani and the Southern Piikani. Later on, they would be joined by the Sarsi and by the Gros Ventres. They spoke different languages, but adhered to a very similar culture. The Iron Confederacy was comprised of the Cree that moved onto the Great Plains around 1740. The southern half of this movement eventually became the Plains Cree, and the northern half would become the Woods Cree. The Salto, which were the Plains Ojibwe, the Nakota or Stony people, also known as the Assiniboine, as well as the Métis and Haudenosaunee. As with most other conflicts amongst Plains tribes, theirs was a rivalry born of resources. The best hunting lands were held by those with the martial ability to acquire and sustain control of an area by running their enemies out, securing some form of peace agreement with them, or by killing them off entirely. In this case, the Blackfoot had long gotten the better of the Cree and their allies. But While the 1860s had certainly not been kind to the Cree and their allies in the Iron Confederacy, they presumed themselves to at least be in better shape than the Blackfoot by 1870. This had led this group of hundreds of warriors to believe that victory was all but guaranteed. Thus, the party carried on through the day until, as the sun began to sink into the eastern horizon, their scouts returned to report that they had found a few teepees at the base of a nearby hill, which were stragglers on their way to what the Cree believed to be the main Blackfoot campsite a short distance away. The decision was made to make a cold camp, no fires, and to wait the night out and attack in the pre-dawn hours. However, a fatal miscalculation had been made. Much like Custer and his men 6 years later at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Cree had vastly underestimated the totality of their opponent's force. Their scouts had been correct. There was indeed a small group of Bloods camped just up the river from the few teepees at the base of the hill. And if that was all there was, this would indeed be an easy route for the Cree. But, in fact, a far larger Blackfoot contingent was camped just up the river from this smaller group. Had the scouts seen this group, perhaps Chief Piapo's vision would have been given more credence at this most critical 11th hour. But they did not. And so, on the morning of October 25, 1870, before the sun had crested the skyline, the initial Cree attack began. The first to fall would be the two families that were camped at the bottom of the hill near the river. They awoke to their teepees being slit open by Cree knives. Everyone inside who was not shot dead with arrows or stabbed to death with spears where they lay was dragged outside and stabbed, slashed, and bludgeoned to death. This included a number of women and children. The next to fall would be the small group of Bloods camped next to the river, who were all asleep in their teepees. The Cree stormed into the camp, which was dead silent after they had killed all the dogs. The only thing that pierced the silence were the Cree yelling, "We're here," as they began slitting open teepees and slaughtering the inhabitants. Now the gunshots began to ring out, as the Bloods, whose camp was far better equipped with rifles and revolvers than their attackers, began to defend their families and their lives. Women and children shrieked in terror as they were cut down trying to cross the river in an attempt to flee to the larger Blackfoot camp. Many were shot down, some were not, and as they rushed into the larger camp to inform the Blackfoot leader, Mountain Chief, of the attack that was underway, they were met by warriors already exiting the camp on their way to defend their Blood allies. By the time the sun had risen, the river valley was swarming with Blackfoot warriors, riding at full speed on their war horses down the ridgeline and encircling the Cree near the river. Now, the hunters had become the hunted, and the Cree were forced to make a retreat. The fighting raged on for hours, with the Blackfoot and Cree ensconced in two ravines that ran parallel to one another. Attacks would be made and retreats attempted, with dozens of warriors on both sides being cut down by mid-afternoon. Eventually, hundreds of Cree warriors tried to swim back across the river and flee into the nearby thicket. But their attempt was spotted by a half-white, half-indigenous Blood scout named Jerry Potts, who was camped with the Blackfoot at the time. He alerted his cohorts to the fleeing body of Cree warriors, and he and the other Blackfoot lined the ridges around the river, shooting down at the mass of their fleeing prey. Potts recalled that the Cree were so thickly gathered and numerous that one could close their eyes and pull the trigger and still manage to kill one of them. Potts and his Blackfoot brethren killed all they could, including all of those who had been brave enough to stand on the shoreline and fight. The few dozen Cree who did make it across the river fled to the open prairie on the other side of the riverbank. The Blackfoot, having killed all the Cree they could at the river, harried their horses in pursuit of the remnants of their attackers' forces. They reached the Cree on the prairie, a few hundred yards from a small thicket. Here they cycloned around them, cutting them down in a running slaughter as the Cree made a desperate change of direction in an attempt to get to the nearby thicket. 50 of the several dozen were cut down before the very few remaining survivors reached the relative cover of the thicket. For what must have been a terrifying few minutes for those Cree warriors trapped in a thicket, the Blackfoot circled around them and shot at them, whooping and taunting the entire time. It must have seemed that a brutal death at the end of a Blackfoot spear or arrow was all but assured. But, as there were so few left, and they no longer posed any direct threat to the village, the Blackfoot let discretion be the better part of valor in this case, and left these few Cree in the thicket, on foot, to navigate their way home alone through the open prairies of Canada as winter set in. As the Blackfoot returned to their camp, the screams of their grieving wives, mothers, husbands, and fathers rang out everywhere. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, and the river itself ran red with the hundreds of gallons of human blood that now rushed into it from the dead and the dying. History would come to know this fight as the Battle of Belly River, and it would be the last and largest intertribal confrontation in Canadian history. But it certainly was not the only one. The tribes of the Northern Plains lived in an unforgiving reality. Their resources were finite, and territory was everything. And thus, as is universally the case with the human condition, conflicts inevitably arose. But for now, those are other stories for other times.
West Texas, 1876. Just as dawn begins to break, a pair of young Apache hunters lope their mounts towards the top of a ridge, being careful to move as quietly as possible, lest they disturb any game in the area. The young hunters are mere teenagers. One is a full-blood Apache named Bobo, riding a fine horse belonging to his father. The other is an adopted member of the tribe. A few years earlier, he had been a German-speaking farm boy on a central Texas farm not far from today's Mason, Texas. His name had been Herman Lehman, though he barely remembered that now. He had been kidnapped by the Apache with his younger brother Willie, taken while the boys were out watching sheep. The pair had suffered terrible abuse at the hands of the Apache, being starved, beaten, and driven without rest for long periods. Willie had managed to escape, but Herman had not. He had eventually been adopted by the Apache as one of their own. Life with the Apache, though, even once he had been adopted into an Apache family, had been difficult. Life for the Apache, and for any tribe in West Texas for that matter, was hard. The sparse landscape and unremitting conflict with Americans, Mexicans, and other tribes made for a perpetually hardscrabble, violent existence. But, at least for the time being, Herman was now, at least ostensibly, one of them. However, he was not fully Apache, and even his new name was quick to remind him of this every time he was addressed by it. His new name was Inda. It meant white boy. Regardless, Herman, or Inda, had thrown himself into the life of a preteen warrior in training under the often brutal tutelage of his adopted father, a chief named Carnoviste. Carnoviste had been the chief of the party who had initially kidnapped Herman and his younger brother from their family's farmstead. He had initiated the young boy into the brutal realities of Apache life before the raiding party had even made it back to their home village. Food on the trail could be scarce, and the luxury of cooking and eating meals while presumably being pursued was not one that could be afforded. Later in life, Herman would recall being force-fed the raw liver of a calf that the party had happened upon and slaughtered, as well as his repeated failure to keep the meal down. A few days later, the young Texan found his appetite less discriminating when the band discovered a few baby antelope that had been left alone when their parents had scattered at the approach of the oncoming Apache. The baby antelope were summarily scooped up and thrown into a leather sack as the Apache proceeded onto their campsite for the night. After several more hours of riding, they stopped and, for the first time in several days, afforded themselves the indulgence of a campfire. After they had the fire built and a sufficient bed of red-hot coals stoked, the antelope, some of whom were still alive, were thrown onto the fire whole to roast to the Apache's content. In his memoirs, 9 Years Among the Indians, linked to purchase in the description, Herman recalls his mix of admiration and horror when the antelope parents, known to track their young down should they wander off, showed up not far from the camp in an attempt to rescue their imperiled young. The Apache quickly shot both, and soon a great feast was had. For almost everyone, it was the first real meal in a long while and was greatly appreciated. And thus life had continued on for Herman, as he transitioned his mindset and lifestyle from that of a young Deutschman on the Texas farm to that of an Apache warrior responsible for eking out a living for himself and his family in a land that offered little and took much. He had learned, though, how to ride, how to track, how to hunt, and how to fight. The Apache were capable of procuring water from places that seemed to not have seen rain in years. They were renowned for their ability to track animals and people in the dusty, rock-strewn expanses of their homelands. They were also held in high regard as warriors and feared as raiders in homesteads and hamlets from Utah to Mexico. However, the desert had not always been their home. They had once been the masters of the vast and bountiful expanses of current-day Texas and the southern plains. They had hunted the expansive buffalo herds, harvested from the pecan trees, camped in the meadows, and swam in the rivers and streams. Then, the Comanche had arrived. Over the course of a few decades, the newcomers to the southern plains, who had made their way down from the northern Rockies and made their martial ascent after mastering the newly available horse, had made it their business to systematically remove the Apache from what is modern-day central and southern Texas. The intensity and scope of the Comanche raids that swept into the Apache villages were unlike anything the Apache, or anyone else in Texas for that matter, had seen before. The Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Caddo, the Waco, the Cheyenne, as well as the Spanish and later the Mexicans and Texans. Regardless of the target of their wrath, the accounts were strikingly and disturbingly similar. All fighting-age males not killed in defending their families would generally be summarily executed via any variety of torturous methods the Comanche employed over the years. Women would generally be assaulted and exploited, sexually and otherwise, and infants would be killed outright, as they posed too much trouble to a raiding party's egress back to their home territory. Children and preteens and some teens were, after a generally brutal induction process, adopted into the tribe, as Herman was with the Apache. The Comanche, in fact, have one of the most impure bloodlines of any tribe on record. Their male mortality rates were unusually high due to the frequency and ferocity of their combat, and their birth rates were relatively low, with miscarriages being a more common phenomenon among the perpetually horse-bound people. Raids would generally conclude with horses and usable goods being taken, and all homes and crops being burned. The Apache had perhaps suffered the wrath of the Comanche more than any other. Though many of the personal accounts would be lost to history, the sheer rapidity of the Apache retreat from their Texas homelands speaks to the ferocity of the attacks. But the Apache had managed to adapt and survive in their new lands. Though the game was less plentiful, it could still be procured, and thus Herman and Bobo had ventured out away from the relative safety of the camp on this morning. They assume, for all intents and purposes, that they are safe from Comanche attack, as they are already far west of the Comanche's typical range. Their only concern is not spooking any game in the area, and being able to find their way back to their village. Then the boys hear the sound of several hoofbeats coming their way. They are the only warriors who had left camp, and thus they know whoever is coming towards them is not from their village. Before the pair can question each other as to what the source of the noise might be, the answer is made all too apparent, as a large band of Comanche warriors suddenly crest the ridge the young Apache boys are at the bottom of. Their only option now is to flee back to their village and attempt to alert as many of their tribesmen as possible in order to marshal some sort of defense. Bobo's horse, fleet of foot and well-bred, turns and gallops back towards the village at full speed, his rider hugging tight to him by squeezing with his knees and hugging close to the horse's neck while staying low. Herman's mule, meanwhile, is not so obedient. The unfortunate animal has, by Herman's account, been beaten so severely for so long that it had become extremely skittish and even more obstinate than its nature had originally dictated. In this particular instance, as Herman urges the animal towards the Apache village and away from the oncoming Comanche, the mule begins to spin in tight circles rather than running in any direction. As the mule spins faster and faster, Herman calls out to Bobo, begging him to come back and help. But his pleas are to no avail, as Bobo, atop his fine mount, pays Herman no heed as he makes his way back in a full panic towards the Apache village. After a number of revolutions, the animal is struck in the hip by a Comanche arrow. This finally breaks the terrified mule from his panicked spin and sends him in a full gallop in the direction of the Apache village. Herman now hangs on for dear life, as the mule picks up more and more speed, finally passing Bobo. The terrified young man now cries out to Herman not to leave him, as his horse begins to tire and the Comanches gain ground. But, as Herman recalls in his own words, "If I had any intention of waiting, it was forlorn, for that dun mule was on the go. There was no stopping him." The mule, with Herman still clinging on to him, barrels through the Apache camp, knocking over women and children in its manic flee back to the village's horse herd, where only minutes before there had been a placid camp with many Apache now just beginning to wake, there was now a scene of pure terror and calamity. Upon reaching the village's horse herd, Herman's mule begins to buck, attempting to dismount his rider and rejoin the perceived safety of its herd. Herman manages to safely dismount, jump on the back of another horse, and make his way back to the village. He arrives back just as the fight against the oncoming Comanches, a force Herman estimates to be roughly 40 warriors, is beginning in earnest. The Apache warriors have met the Comanche charge and managed to drive them back. As Herman scans the force of Apache warriors, loosing arrows and bullets upon the Comanche, he searches for the face of his hunting companion Bobo. But he is nowhere to be found. As arrows whiz all around, he notices a contingent of warriors pressing forward toward an area just outside the bounds of the village. Then, he sees the body of his friend, crumpled on the ground. His back is full of thick Comanche arrows, and he has been scalped. The young, carefree hunter who had taken to the wilderness with Herman just this morning was now gone. Unable to process the gravity of these events in the moment, Herman can only express rage as he joins the group of Comanche fighting their way forward to recapture the body of the young warrior. Herman later recounted the events in his memoirs. Every foot of ground was contested. The Comanche were nasty fighters, but we greatly outnumbered them. The battle began about 10 o'clock in the morning and raged most of the day. About sundown, the Comanches withdrew, leaving many of their comrades dead on the battlefield. Never tried to follow them, for 20 of our braves had gone to the happy hunting ground, while 8 more were writhing in pain, 4 of whom died that night in spite of the prayers and incantations of our medicine man. 1 more died the next day, but the other 3 recovered. Our dead were given a decent burial. Herman and his cohorts now moved back to the battlefield, still stinking of iron and slick with blood, to retrieve any usable weapons from the dead Comanche. Guns, bows, arrows, and shields are all collected, as are any horses that are not dead or wounded. The dead Comanche warriors are afforded no respect. They are gathered up and thrown into a hole in the ground, left to the ravages of the wolves, coyotes, and buzzards. The Apache then hurriedly pack their things and break camp, moving north at a rapid pace in case there were more Comanche in the area to be avoided. Scouts are sent out in every direction to scour the landscape for any Comanche in hiding. And soon, 2 Comanche spies are discovered. One is shot and killed outright upon discovery, while the other is captured and hauled in to be tortured. Colonel Viste, Herman's adopted father and the village's chief, cuts holes in both the Comanche's arms, strings a rawhide cord through them, and hangs the warrior up from a tree, leaving him to expire as the Comanches move on. Herman would later recall, with no small amount of disgust, how an old Apache squaw, whose nose had been cut off for infidelity, had felt bad for the Comanche and later snuck back and cut him down. Such soft-heartedness was seen as a reprehensible trait in these harsh environs. Finally, the party arrives at a spring some 60 miles from their previous encampment. They stay for a few days, trying to come to terms with their intermittent, overwhelming grief and rage. One morning, soon after arriving to the spring, an old Apache man wakes in a sweat. He stirs his family awake and tells them of a terrifying vision he has just seen in his dreams. They then report the vision to Colonel, who listens intently as the old man describes his nightmare in detail. He says he has seen a great horde of Comanches chasing after them, and that soon these Comanche would be upon them. A collective pang of terror now sweeps through the village, and the elders come together to hold a council. All day, the Apache abstain from food and drink, and discuss what course of action they might take next. The majority of the Apache advocate for simply packing up and leaving the area altogether, rather than risk greater losses against a foe that had hounded them so incessantly for so long. Thus, Colonel and the rest of the village elders agree to pack up and move the village again, making as much haste as possible. The horses and mules are again hurriedly loaded, and the Apache move west. They move along quietly, doing their best to be as discreet as possible in this landscape that offers little in the way of tactical cover. They travel for 20 miles and begin to think that perhaps all of this was much ado about nothing. So much effort spent for the ravings of a sleep-deprived old man. Then, as though they have stepped onto a hornet's nest, the Comanche are everywhere. Somehow, where once the horizon had been bare, are now dozens of Comanche warriors coming at the Apache full bore, loosing arrows all the while. In the minutes that followed, utter devastation was wrought on the small Apache band. 40 of their warriors were killed, most of their women and children were taken captive by the Comanche, and all of their horses, food, and equipment was stolen. The Comanche, for their part, also suffered significant losses at the hands of the Apache, as the Apache had, in this particular fight, more rifles at hand than did their opponents. By Herman's later estimation, roughly 100 Apache warriors, along with 6 women, are able to escape on foot. For a full month, they wander the desolate landscape, barely surviving on what little food and water they could find. Finally, Herman and the other survivors cross paths with another band of Comanche, 150 warriors strong and well armed. They inform this band of the horrors they have suffered over the past several weeks at the hands of the Comanche, and a call is put out, all across Apache territory, for the bands to meet at a known spot on the plains, a dry lake bed known to the entire tribe. As Apache scouts carry the word from camp to camp, warriors begin to pour into the lake bed location from areas as far away as Utah, Arizona, and Mexico. As warfighters stream into the camp, they find it a hive of activity. Herman and all of his fellow warriors are hard at work, making arrows, hardening spear points, cleaning rifles, and reinforcing shields. The Apache had decided that they would no longer bear the brunt of Comanche wrath. The time had come for their people to unite and reap their proverbial pound of flesh from the Comanche transgressors who had, for so long and so egregiously, abused them. They had, many of them felt, reached the point of no return. There was no longer room for both they and the Comanche to exist, and they would now do their best to eradicate them outright and reclaim the homeland that was rightfully theirs. Hatred for the Comanche is so intense that even the women and children are drilled, again and again, in the handling of weapons and potential paths of egress, should their fathers and brothers be overtaken in the great battle to come. For the Apache and Comanche, a time of reckoning is at hand. Even the legendary chiefs Victorio and Geronimo come to the camp, ready to make war. It is Victorio himself who volunteers to lead a band of his most trusted scouts out into the west in a preliminary search for any Comanche in the territory. But as days pass, and as more and more Apache pour into the camp, and the pace of preparation becomes even more frantic, there is still no sign of Victorio's scouting party. Finally, the legendary chief straggles back into the camp, barely hanging on to his mount. All of his companions have been killed, he says, and the Comanche now know that the Apache are again encroaching into their territory. A council is again held, where Victorio, Geronimo, Carnoviste, and other chiefs all give their opinions on what to do next. Victorio advocates for peace with the Comanche. He says, "I fear not the Comanche myself, neither am I afraid of their allies, the Kiowa. But these tribes are strong among themselves and greatly outnumber us. Besides, the whites furnish them with guns and powder and lead to help exterminate our tribe. The white man is the Indians' enemy, and the Indians must quit fighting among themselves and all go together to fight the palefaces. While I was gone, on a previous trip, I saw as many palefaces as there are sprigs of grass on the plains or stars in the sky, and if we continue to fight each other, we will all be exterminated by the white men." Red Wasp, another chief, argued that we do not fear the cowardly palefaces. They have robbed us of our hunting grounds. They have destroyed our game. They have brought us disease. They have stirred up discord among our own race. They have intimidated our braves. They have made profligates of our children, reprobates of our wives, and destroyed our traditions. They have wrought despair and desolation to our tribes, and for my part, I am ready to fight until I fall. As to the Comanche, our grievances are great, and the cause of war is just, and I'll be glad to kill them when they come. Kill them as they kill our companions. Kill them. Kill them. And if we must die, let us fight to the bitter end. I want to fight." Finally, it is decided that a truce with the Comanche will be attempted. If it can be achieved, perhaps the two tribes can finally present a unified front against the centuries-long incursions of the whites, be they Texans, Americans, Mexicans, or Spanish. The next day, the Apache, under a white flag of truce raised high on a pole, make their way to within 3 miles of the Comanche camp. Soon, a Comanche warrior comes riding toward them. He circles the Apache party from a safe distance, whooping and taunting them, waving a black shield over his head. This is a challenge of war to the death, with all the vanquished being killed, be they warriors, women, or children. Now, the moment of truth arrives. Should the Apaches send out their own warrior, holding up a red shield, the invitation to battle would be accepted, and the fight would unfold. But instead, much to the Comanche's surprise, the Apache rider comes forward unarmed, still flying the white flag of truce. The Comanche, still incredulous, make signs for 6 of their men to meet 6 of the Apache at a halfway point between the two parties. 6 Apache men are selected to go forward, and they ride out to meet the Comanche. The Comanche, for their part, agree to make peace so long as the offending Apache who had tortured their tribesmen was handed over to be dealt with as they saw fit. The Apache emissaries, very much aware that the offending chief the Comanche were referring to was the very much alive and well Carnoviste, informed the Comanche that, unfortunately, the Apache who had so mistreated their warrior was unfortunately killed in the earlier battle. Disappointed, but unwilling to pursue the matter further, the Comanche agree to drop the issue altogether and pursue a unified, mutually beneficial peace. Upon this precarious falsehood, a truce is agreed to. The women and children who had been taken captive in the earlier raid are returned to their Apache families, and many tears of joy and celebration are the order of the day. Some of the Apache women even agree to, or are forced to, depending on the account, stay with their captors in order to solidify the relations between the two tribes via marital bonds. They are adopted into the tribe immediately, as is the old woman with no nose who cut down the Comanche. Herman, for his part, is not sad to see her go. Ultimately, Herman credits Victorio for opening the door to peace between the two tribes. Though their plans for unity and retaliation would never ultimately materialize, the diplomacy and political dexterity shown by Victorio in this instance are without doubt belonging to a rarefied strata of achievement and leadership. And while this particular tale ended well, the times before and after in which conflicts such as these ended in untold bloodshed and suffering are too numerous to mention. And the tales of young Herman Lehman, who would eventually kill a medicine man in retaliation for the murder of Carno Viste and escape to join the Comanche, do not end here either. But for now, those are other stories for other times.
Northern New Zealand, 1807. As the chilly winds of the Pacific whip down upon them, a large band of Maori warriors stops to make camp after a long night's march. They are members of an iwi, or tribal band of the Maori, known as the Napui. Their force is roughly 500 warriors in total, full of veterans spoiling for a fight. They are on the warpath and have been on the move all night in an attempt to position themselves within striking distance of their target. Their target is an encampment of their hated rivals, the neighboring Ngāti-Wā-Tua. The years prior have been marred by incessant intertribal warfare, seeing thousands of Maori perish at the hands of warriors from rival tribes. Battles could be vast in both scope and bloodshed, with rival armies numbering into the thousands. Rival chiefs would invest great amounts of time and capital into recruiting neighboring bands to attack a mutual rival. Though there is no historical consensus on the exact genesis of this conflict between the Napui and the Ngāti-Wā-Tua, it is thought among many to have started over one side being shorted of their allotment in the annual fish harvest. If true, such effrontery would indeed merit a military response, at least in the minds of many Maori at the time. The conditions in northern New Zealand are both unforgiving and unyielding, and the failure to stock up on provisions when they are available can spell certain death for the unprepared. Fighting between bands has been particularly brutal as of late, as retaliation begets retaliation in an ongoing and ever-growing blood feud. But this group of warriors, stopping to eat their simple meals of dried fish and sweet potatoes, have a new weapon that they hope will make a decisive difference in conquering their enemies. Though New Zealand had had some measure of contact with Europeans since Dutchman Abel Tasman had sailed into their waters in 1642, recent dealings with European merchant ships have resulted in the Napui acquiring the most technologically advanced weaponry used to date in Maori warfare: the musket. Maori weaponry typically consisted of war clubs, spears, and shields. With these weapons in hand, a Maori warrior is capable of wreaking unremitting damage in close combat. However, the musket, a new introduction to the north of New Zealand, is capable of inflicting not only physical, but psychological damage on a scale yet unseen by the Maori. This contingent of Napui warriors is led by a revered war chief named Pokaia. Pokaia is a descendant of a line of chiefs, likely the eldest son of his father, as mana or power is generally inherited, passed on from father to son. He has spent much of the preceding few months recruiting warriors from smaller camps, fostering a collective sense of resentment and unrest amongst those bands and chieftains who felt their treatment at the hands of the Ngāti-Wā-Tua had been unreasonable or outright unjust. He has driven his band of 500 warriors hard all night, heading south from their homelands until reaching the mouth of Moramanui Gully. Now, as the sun's morning rays begin to peek over the horizon, the warriors enjoy their breakfast in stoic silence, each deeply enjoying the brief respite from the incessant demands of Maori warfare. As they eat and make quiet, exhausted conversation with each other, it seems to all that, despite their being immersed in the intensity of pre-combat fervor, the morning itself will prove to be quite scenic and even enjoyable. For a brief moment, the confident army, replete with a sizable force and notable technological advantage, seems to breathe a collective sigh of relief. A brief veil of silence then seems to fall over the camp, so fleeting that the Napui scarcely seem to notice the oddity of a complete, total silence in the trees and tall grass that surrounds them. Then, with the fury of a seismic wave crashing into the nearby beach, the world all around the Napui seems to explode. Suddenly, what had seemingly been placid blades of tall grass only moments earlier erupts into a hailstorm of innumerable Maori warriors, hailing from the Napui's intended target, the Ngāti-Wātua. The Ngāti-Wātua have received warnings from their scouts in the area of the oncoming Napui war party and decided that the only way to combat the sizable force advancing upon them is to employ a surprise attack. Though the Maori are indeed highly organized warriors, capable of not only carrying out lengthy, complex tactical maneuvers, and are perhaps the most adept purveyors of siege warfare on the planet at the time, they are also masters in the art of planning and executing ambushes. Under the command of their chiefs Murupenga, Tuware, and Teaoho, they had hidden amidst the foliage in Mora Manui Gully, knowing that that was the most viable campsite for a force of 500 warriors for miles around. As the sweet potatoes and fish they had been enjoying moments earlier are now flung to the ground, the Napui scramble for their weapons. In the chaos of the ensuing melee, those armed with the muskets they had hoped would wreak such havoc now find them to be of little use. The Napui are, in fact, hardly proficient in the maintenance or use of the muskets. Many misfire, and many more send their single shots sailing harmlessly into the dirt or over the heads of their intended targets. As most of the lead balls whiz harmlessly through the air, and the sickening ping of their misfires resounds through the camp, Ngāti-Wātua warriors flood in among the 500-strong invading force, clubbing, slashing, and stabbing as they go. As the din of the initial volley from the muskets fades into the dawn air, it is replaced with the repeated sickening thuds of Maori war clubs meeting flesh and bone. War cries abound, as do the lamentations of the wounded. No quarter is given, and none expected, as the battle unfolds in brutal fashion. As the fight goes on, the Napui are pushed further and further out onto the beach. Though caught off guard by both the ambush and the relative failure of their new weapons, the Napui fight fiercely, as do the Ngāti-Wātua. One account relates how the Ngāti-Wātua chief Taoho is speared through the cheek by an attacker. Rather than retreat, Taoho pulls the attacker, still holding his weapon, closer to him and dispatches him with his war club. Finally, the Napui chief, Pokaia, is felled by yet another mighty blow from the war club of Taoho. Seeing the death of their leader, the remaining force of anywhere from 200 to 350 surviving Napui scatter, fleeing for their lives northward up the beach. The Ngāti-Wātua give immediate chase, cutting down the slower among the retreating Napui with reckless abandon until they are called to a halt by their chief Taoho. He orders a line drawn in the sand and that none of his warriors should pursue the Napui beyond it. The root cause behind this display of mercy shows the inexorable closeness in both proximity and bloodline between even the most bitter rivals of the Maori. Chief Taoho has relatives and, not to mention, trading connections with the Napui, and despite their insolence and aggression, he does not wish to damage their relations any further. However, this charity does not extend to the roughly 150 to 300 dead Napui warriors now strewn about the beach, seemingly as though washed up by a storm. These unfortunate slain will suffer the fate of the vanquished in Maori tradition. Dozens are summarily butchered and consumed by the Ngāti-Wātua until the warriors have consumed their fill both spiritually and temporally. Then their remains are left where they have fallen. For weeks to come, the Ngāti-Wātua will witness large flocks of seagulls congregating on the beach from their village a few miles away. This macabre event will give birth to the Maori name for this battle, Tekai a Tikal, or the Seagulls' Feast. Though it is merely a continuation of an ongoing feud, and in fact much smaller in scale than many previous engagements between the two factions, the Seagulls' Feast marks a seminal point in Maori history, the beginning of what will come to be known as the Maori Musket Wars. These brutal wars will carry on over a period of 3 decades, from 1807 until 1837, and will see as many as 3,000 separate engagements between rival Maori bands. The Musket Wars will result in the deaths of between 20,000 and 40,000 Maori, and the loss of countless more to the throes of slavery as prisoners of war. But, for tonight, the stories of these battles, as well as the countless tales of heartache, horror, and heroism that abound within the 30-year history of the Musket Wars, are other stories for other times.
Colorado, 1853. Despite the vibrant colors of spring all around him, Little Robe rides with a heavy heart. Even the placid stirring of the Platte River has failed to soothe his weary heart and frazzled nerves as morning melts into the warm afternoon. He is making his way south to the largest village of his tribe, the feared and formidable Cheyenne. His mind has been caught under a cloud of dread for weeks now, as had many of the Cheyenne. His band's beloved chief, a respected warrior named Alights on a Cloud, has been killed in a battle against their hated enemies, the Pawnee. For weeks now, the Pawnee have raided, abused, and outright murdered their way through several smaller Cheyenne encampments. Now, Little Robe is out to seek help. And, not long after he turns down Beaver Creek, a tributary of the Platte River, his spirits lift. He spots the large Cheyenne village already stirring with activity. This is always a busy time of year, just before the summer buffalo hunts. For the Cheyenne, it is the time of the Medicine Lodge ceremony, their most important ceremony of the year. But this year, the camp is even more abuzz than normal. For days now, visitors from smaller bands have been pouring into the camp. They seek refuge from the Pawnee onslaught, hoping the sheer numbers of people in the larger camp will afford them some relative measure of safety. But also, perhaps just as pertinently, they seek revenge. In the recent weeks, many had seen their loved ones killed and their possessions ransacked by the Pawnee. As Little Robe rides into the camp, he sees a line of people gathered in front of the largest lodges in the village. Each waiting Cheyenne carries with them a gift of some kind, from blankets to food, with some even bringing horses. Inside the lodges are gathered the vaunted warrior societies of the Cheyenne: the Fox Warrior Society, the Elk Warrior Society, the Shield Warrior Society, and the Dog Warrior Society. Each band holds a revered place in the Cheyenne, serving as part military force, part police force, and part hunting party. Little Robe is here to visit all of them. For the preceding week, he has traveled all over the territory. He and other messengers had beseeched the Kiowa, the Burnt Thigh Sioux, the Apache, and their always stalwart allies, the Arapaho, to come to their aid in avenging the Pawnee attacks. Now, Little Robe seeks to gain the unified support of all the Cheyenne warrior societies. He makes his way from lodge to lodge, informing the heads of each society as to the nature of his visit, and reinforcing the stories of Pawnee atrocities being decried by the Cheyenne outside their lodge doors. To each headman, Little Robe presents a pipe of war. Taking 4 draws from the pipe signifies the headman's commitment of his society's services in combating the Pawnee. Each war chief, from Kit Fox, Shield, Elk, Bowstring, and Dog societies respectively, pledged their and their band's allegiance to combating their hated enemies. Within a few days, their allies who have also committed to the fight also begin to pour into the camp. The Kiowa, the Apache, the Burnt Leg Sioux, a few Crow warriors, and the Arapaho all come to the camp eager to hunt down the Pawnee and avenge their prior losses. But before any warriors from any tribe can take to the warpath, there is first the matter of the medicine ceremony. Often misunderstood as a test of mettle, the medicine ceremony, a common practice in many northern plains tribes, consisted of days of fasting, chanting, and dancing, all while tethered to a large pole in the lodge via leather cords pierced through the skin of their upper chest.
Young men are generally selected or volunteer to subject themselves to the torturous ceremony, but it is seen as more of a spiritual quest than a public demonstration of pain tolerance. It is the Kit Fox soldiers who will be heading up this endeavor, as they are often deferred to, especially amongst the northern Cheyenne. Thus, they are bound by Cheyenne tradition to participate in the medicine ceremony. The ceremony is a central aspect of Cheyenne society, one few outsiders at this time have been privy to witness. However, George Bird Grinnell, an American anthropologist, historian, naturalist, and author of The Fighting Cheyenne, as well as The Cheyenne Indians and Their History and Lifeways, links to purchase in the description, gives the following description. The afternoon before the sacrifice was to be made, the warrior and two older warriors who had been through the ceremony before and were to serve as his instructors went out to cut the pole to which he was to be tied. When a young cottonwood tree suitable for the pole was found, they grasped his arms and caused him to move his hands 4 times towards the tree, as if cutting it with an axe. Then he cut the pole without further ceremony. They now caused him to pick it up from the ground, making 4 motions before lifting it, and then 4 motions before dragging it away to the chosen place for the sacrifice. When the place was reached, the instructors showed him how to dig the hole in which it was to stand, making 4 preliminary motions before actually beginning to dig the hole. The pole was not trimmed. The leaves and branches were left on it. That night after the 3 had reached camp, a messenger was sent about the camp to find and borrow 2 braided rawhide riatas. Next morning the 3 men arose very early, and long before daylight, each instructor took one of the ropes and rubbed his hands down over its whole length 4 times. Then a coal was taken from the fire, sweet grass sprinkled on it, and each rope was passed 4 times through the smoke. Then, to one end of each rope were tied 2 deerskin strings, each 7 or 8 inches long. Each rope was now doubled into a ball in the middle, leaving the end to which the strings were tied to be attached to the skewers in his body 4 or 5 feet long, and on the other end to be tied to the pole somewhat longer. Just before daylight, the instructors painted him white with clay over the whole body. After he had been painted, they caused him to sit and filled and lighted a pipe, and offered him to smoke it 4 times, and each time he smoked. The pipe was held to his mouth. He did not touch it with his hands. After he had smoked, the instructors told him that their direction to perform this sacrifice was the greatest favor that he could have received, the privilege to stand by a pole in the sun's road where the sun could look down and see him. It might be a hard trial, but he must not give up. After he had received this instruction, he set out with 2 older men to go to the place where the pole was. When they set out, he walked in advance, wrapped in a buffalo robe and carrying 2 ropes. The instructors followed. When they reached the place where the pole was, the warriors sat down near the pole. While waiting, the 2 instructors tied the 2 ropes to the pole. South of the pole, and facing southward, was placed a buffalo skull. Now it was time for him to be pierced. He knelt, sitting back on his heels, and rested his hands on his knees, opposite to and facing the pole. The instructors knelt at his right side and with charcoal marked upright parallel lines on the skin on the right breast to indicate where the knife should enter and where it should come out. One instructor then took the skin in his fingers above the marks and the other below the marks, and pinching up the skin, they thrust in the knife at the marked place on the right, and it came through at the marked place on the other side. The left breast was pierced in the same way. When the right breast was pierced, the instructors, assisting each other, passed a small straight stick, the length of a finger, through the slit, and to this skewer tied the strings on one of the ropes. After the left breast was pierced, a similar skewer was passed through that slit and tied. After the strings had been tied, the instructors raised the warrior to his feet and supported and directed him as he walked the sage-covered path towards the pole. Then the instructors pulled 4 times on his breast to straighten out the ropes. they moved his body toward the east and then toward the west 4 times. Then he began to walk to the west end of the sage-covered trail and back to the east end, going back and forth until the sun had set. It seemed to him to take the sun a long time to reach the middle, but the time from the middle to the sun's setting was much longer. He was constantly trying to break loose, but the skin of his breast did not break. It only stretched. He had the privilege of resting 4 times, in the middle of the forenoon, at noon, in the middle of the afternoon, and just before sunset. At each of these rests he might smoke a pipe. During the day, the instructors built a sweat house in the camp. At sundown, they came to the warrior, grasped his arms, one on each side, and pushed him down to a sitting position. They cut through the stretched hide of his breast, took him back to the camp, and entered the sweat lodge with him, some other men who had made this sacrifice also going into it. His wounds and the blood on his body were wiped off with white sage. On each of the 3 following days he took a sweat, and on the 4th day the ceremony was finished. The Kit Fox soldiers all take part, as do warriors from many of the other societies. On the final day of the ceremony, 2 Cheyenne warriors named Wood and Two Thighs, chiefs of the Kit Fox soldiers, speak about finding where the Cheyenne are located. Wood says, "Now, this is the last day of the dance. We are not far from the country of the Pawnees, and it is time for us to choose scouts and send them out to find the Pawnee camp." Two Thighs concurs and suggests a young warrior named Mad Wolf, saying, "There is Mad Wolf over there. He is pretty cunning. Let us choose him for one." They also summon Tall Bull, Starving Elk, and Little Wolf, all fellow Cheyenne, as well as Yellow Bear, an Arapaho warrior, and Dirt on the Nose from the Kiowas. All 7 warriors are brought to the Kit Fox Soldier Lodge, where a blanket is spread out in front of the door. They are all ordered to sit on the blanket as the Kit Fox chief Wood addresses them, saying, "Now, my friends, you know what the feeling is in this camp, that we want to find the enemy. You men have been chosen for this purpose because we think that you are good men, and we want you to go ahead and to do your best. You must remember you are not going out to count coup, nor to take any scalps nor horses, but we are going to find where the enemy is, and then to bring back the news to the camp. I intend to go along with you to see that you do as you are told. You can go now and get your horses, and start on down the river. I will go ahead, and I will stop at a certain place, where we will all meet late this afternoon." Chief Wood sets out ahead of the younger warriors as they go to gather their horses and weapons. The chief now rides several miles down Beaver Creek before stopping on a high ridge from which he can easily see the surrounding landscape. Here, he waits on the party of young warriors. After a few hours, the warriors show up. They are, much to the chief's dismay, accompanied by 3 other young warriors who had not been invited, but have insisted on tagging along. However, the chief acquiesces to their presence, as they are too far from the main camp to send them back alone. The group travels on for a day and a half, sleeping little, stopping only once for a quick meal and a short repose for themselves and their horses. Finally, in the afternoon of their 2nd day of travel, they come upon a pack of wolves feasting on a buffalo carcass. The warriors chase the wolves off in order to better inspect the carcass. Embedded deep in the hulking animal's torso is an arrow with markings they all recognize as Pawnee. Yellow Bear, a dog soldier of the Arapaho, rides to the top of a nearby hill, only to return rapidly with news that he has spotted 3 Pawnee riders heading south over a hill about a mile away. The young warrior, now flushed with the desire for combat, begins to ride in circles, singing his war song and insisting they give chase. Chief Wood patiently but firmly walks up to Yellow Bear's horse and grabs hold of the reins, stopping the animal. He then speaks calmly but resolutely, saying, "My friend, we came out here to find the enemy, and then to go back and report to the village. We did not come out to take scalps, nor to count coup. Let us do what we came to do, and nothing else. In no position to disagree, the younger warrior defers to his chief's wishes, and the party makes haste back to the Cheyenne village. After another grueling ride back, taking another day and a half, the party rides into camp bringing with them the fruits of their reconnaissance. They inform their friends, families, and fellow warriors that the Pawnee have been spotted. In order to capitalize on this opportunity, they must take to the trail back to the Pawnee as soon as possible. However, as with all raids, hunts, and special occasions, the Cheyenne and all of their allies have to make right with their perceived spirit world. Before the ceremony, all of the warrior bands are told to send forth a pair of representatives in full war regalia. Every society sends forth their representatives, fully armed and painted for war. They march in an extended line, spaced out roughly 100 yards from each other, through the center of the village. Turning left, they amass just outside of the village. Two elder chiefs ritually cleanse and bless the tribe's sacred bundle of arrows, known as the medicine arrows, as well as a buffalo skull cap, known as the medicine hat. These are considered items of great spiritual power, whose possession comes with a weighty responsibility to protect the arrows and uphold the virtues they represent. Once this ceremony is finished, the war paint is washed off and the weapons sheathed. All the lodges are broken down and packed up, and the village is made ready to move down the creek. Spirits are high, as many in the group have come to this camp specifically to seek revenge for the Pawnee attacks wrought upon them. The next day, the camp moves out and heads down the stream several miles before stopping and re-establishing a new site. While the women work on setting up the lodges, the chiefs again assemble and call out a roster of names they have agreed to send out on another scouting mission. They call upon Tall Bull and Warbonnet, two of the warriors from the original reconnaissance squad that had gone forward a few days earlier. A dog soldier named Wolfface is assigned to accompany this squad, as are three other dog soldiers. They are ordered to ready their horses and their weapons. But this time, there will be no ceremony. Now, there are only the cold, hard calculations of combat. The party assembles and leaves immediately, heading south again towards where the Pawnee had been previously seen. They travel all through the afternoon and most of the night. They sleep fleetingly for a few hours before the sun rises, then again take to the trail. In the early afternoon, they come to the location where Tall Bull had originally seen the Pawnee. They top the hill that Tall Bull had originally seen the Pawnee flee over, only to come upon a large, empty space on the prairie, dotted with smoldering campfires, buffalo carcasses, and stray Pawnee dogs. To the southwest of this camp, the warriors spot a trail that leads over another hill. The 6 warriors ride to the top of that hill, hopping off their mounts and crawling towards the crest of the ridge that overlooks the valley that sweeps down before it. At the bottom of the valley, tucked next to the creek, is the large village of Pawnees. Tall Bull and Wolfface slip down into the stream bed above the village and silently work their way down towards the village for a closer look. They see a massive campfire in the middle of a large circle of many Pawnee men, women, and children, all circling the fire and dancing. Off to one side stand a contingent of warriors from another tribe. The young Cheyenne recognize them as Shawnee, longtime allies of the Pawnee whose homelands are far to the east. The 2 Cheyenne warriors observe the camp for a while, then slip back to their waiting comrades to inform them of what they've seen. Tall Bull sees this as a prime opportunity for all of them to pad their warrior resumes. He suggests that they all, one by one, cover themselves with blankets, disguising themselves as one of the Pawnee. Then, he says, they can sneak into the camp to mingle with the Pawnee and their allies. Each time any of them touched a Pawnee or one of their allies, they would be able to count it as a coup. Counting coup is a well-known and oft mythologized practice among many of the Northern Plains tribes. The practice involved getting close enough to an enemy to touch him, either with a special rod known as a coup stick, or by bow or by hand. Doing so demonstrated the warrior's fearlessness of the enemy and garnered him accolades demonstrated in the way of either feathers added to a war bonnet or some other form of material compensation. On this day, though, one of the other Cheyenne warriors manages to talk Tall Bull down from his grand ambitions. "No, we had better not do that," the Cheyenne warrior said. "We were not sent here to count coup or to mingle with these people, but to find the camp. Let us go back." Letting discretion be the better part of valor, the group makes its way back to the village to report that they had found the Pawnee. After a hard ride, they arrive back to the Cheyenne village and inform their cohorts of what they have discovered. The camp erupts into a flurry of activity as the men ready their weapons and the women erect tall platforms on which to leave their buffalo meat and sundries out of reach of the hungry wolves. The entire camp, stripped down to its bare essentials, moves in the direction of the Pawnee. The men ride in front, with the women and children kept well behind. Another arduous day and a half of travel finds them within 5 miles of the Pawnee village. The women and children all converge behind a large hill, hidden from sight and under the watch of a contingent of warriors on guard. The men then ride forward, still hidden from the Pawnee, and carry out their medicine ceremony. The sacred hat is placed on the ground, atop a bed of stems and sage. An arrow is then taken from the sacred bundle and given to Woodleg, who points it towards the Pawnee camp and sings the arrow song. As he does so, Woodleg stomps his feet in time with the song. The rest of the dog soldiers, kitfox soldiers, bowstring soldiers, elk soldiers, and their Arapaho and Kiowa allies begin to stomp in time as well. Wooden Leg begins to stab the arrow in the direction of the Pawnee, stomping harder and harder. The rest of the warrior force, in turn, stomps harder as well. They too begin to thrust their spears and bows in the direction of the Pawnee village. Finally, Woodleg finishes his song to the subdued whoops of his comrades, still far enough away from the Pawnee that they cannot be heard. Woodleg then passes the arrow back to Rock Forehead, keeper of the medicine arrows. Long Chin, a respected dog soldier, then rides up to the keeper of the medicine hat. He will be the warrior to wear the hat on this day, and he accepts the responsibility somberly but excitedly. Black Kettle, a legendary Cheyenne chief who would be killed years later in the Sand Creek Massacre, was chosen to tie the medicine arrows to his lance. The Cheyenne are now ready, their warrior medicine fully prepared. Then, as they make one last head count before heading out towards the Pawnee village, they find themselves sickened to realize that Big Head, a young, arrogant warrior, had taken off earlier with 8 younger warriors intending to amass their own glory before their comrades could arrive. Breaking formation like this is not only a poor tactical decision, it is, for the Cheyenne, a metaphysical disaster. The medicine that they had so meticulously cultivated for this battle is now broken. This, to say the least, is now a bad situation for the Cheyenne and their allies. But there is no turning back now. Their cover will have been blown by the premature raiding party, and if they do not attack now, they may soon find themselves, and their families, caught and killed by the Pawnee and their allies. The main force now charges forward, under the navigational direction of Tall Bull and Wolfface. But when they crest the hill overlooking the valley, they find the Pawnee village is gone. All in the party realize the pertinence of their pursuit, though, and without hesitation, the party begins to make its way down the creek in one direction and then the other, in a desperate search for their Pawnee enemy. Then they spot a group of mounted warriors coming straight at them. The Cheyenne make their way towards this party, thinking them to be Pawnee. However, as the two parties near each other, the Cheyenne recognize the oncoming group as Big Head
and his group of young absconders. Big Head is covered in blood and holding the fresh scalp of a Pawnee. But despite his newly acquired trophy, he wears the face of a young warrior who has bitten off more than he had initially bargained for. But there is no time to berate him or his followers, as finding the Pawnee is the first order of business. The camp is right over the hill, Big Head informs them, before warily adding, "Go slowly, for there are many of them." The Cheyenne, without further conversation, then converge and attack over the hill. To their horror, just as Big Head had warned, the Pawnee and their allies have now amassed for battle in a defensive formation on the riverbank. The opposing warrior force seems too numerous to count. Believing themselves to have no other option, though, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa make charge after charge, each with increasing ferocity and decreasing personnel, as the Pawnee proceed to pick off the mounted warriors from their defensive positions. The battle rages on for the bulk of the day, with the Cheyenne taking significant losses. Then, about mid-afternoon, they spot a party of Shawnee flanking their position and taking up their own positions atop another hill to their right. The Kiowa insist that they too are allies with the Shawnee. They will, they say, simply make their way over to the Shawnee and recruit them to switch sides. This plan, however, falls through immediately, as the first Kiowa emissary sent forward is summarily shot dead before he even reaches the Shawnee lines. Seeing this, the Cheyenne retreat back to the top of another hill, further from the Shawnee position. The Shawnee give chase, only to be driven back by the Cheyenne. Finally, two Shawnee who venture out too close to the Cheyenne are ridden down and killed. One is lanced by the legendary Kiowa chief Santanta, the other shot dead by a Cheyenne named Good Bear. The Pawnee now arrive to reinforce their allies, and an intense, sizable assault is made on the Cheyenne over the course of the next few minutes. In the ensuing bloodshed, 17 Cheyenne warriors, 4 Arapaho warriors, and several Kiowa warriors are killed. Seeing their medicine as truly broken, and all hope being lost, the Cheyenne and their allies make the agonizing decision to retreat, leaving their dead comrades to the mutilations of the Pawnee. They ride hard and fast back to their families. When they arrive back to the Cheyenne camp, great moans and wails float up from the prairie, as newly widowed women are informed of their beloved husbands' fates. There is no time to grieve, however. Amidst their tears, the Cheyenne make a desperate, hurried march north. They know the Pawnee will be out for revenge, and time is of the essence. It is not until they reach the territory of Beaver Creek, another day and a half of hard riding later, that the events of the previous few days can be given time to truly sink in. The funeral ceremonies are carried out, and a period of great despair takes hold over the Cheyenne camp. But there is still a harsh winter to prepare for, and now, with fewer warriors on hand, this summer's buffalo hunt will be an even more dangerous and arduous endeavor. Life in the Old West is a cruel, harsh, and often short affair. For the Cheyenne and for the Pawnee, who, despite their victory, have lost many warriors as well, this cycle of viciousness and vengeance was the inescapable reality of life on the plains. The stories of great tragedies, unspeakable violence, inspiring cooperation, and harrowing endurance are too numerous to mention amongst the Cheyenne, Pawnee, or any of their allies. All are tales worthy of great reverence and respect. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Southwestern Oklahoma, 1848. In the middle of the night, deep in the Wichita Mountains, a small village of Comanche lies quiet, with almost all of its inhabitants deep in slumber. Inside of a warm teepee, a young mother and her infant son are sleeping peacefully. The woman's name is Nautha, and she is the wife of a revered war chief named Peta Nakona. The baby boy is the couple's first child together and the apple of his parents' eye. His name is Quanah. For weeks now, since the day of his birth, Petanacona has fawned over his newborn son. He has bragged and boasted to his comrades about the size and strength of his boy and of the great deeds he would surely accomplish as a hunter and warrior. But on this night, Petanacona is miles away. He and the rest of the able-bodied warriors in the village are on the warpath. The Comanche are a mighty people who have laid claim to the most valuable real estate on the plains for roughly a century and a half by now. By this point in the late 1840s, they have subjugated or driven off virtually anyone who was opposed them, from the Tonkawa to the Spanish to, most recently, the Texans. In doing so, they have acquired an extensive list of enemies, from the aforementioned adversaries in the Spanish, Texans, and Tonkawas, to itinerant Mexican farmers and American fur traders. The Comanche had not hesitated to inflict horrific damages in order to sustain their territories in the southern plains. The afternoon prior to this evening, Petanacona had assembled his band of raiders, and the party had headed west. This group is largely composed of warriors from the Nokoni, or Wanderers Band, and likely includes a few members from other bands, as well as their longtime allies, the Kiowa. Their intention is to engage a Navajo war party that has been spotted in the area. Their conflict with the Navajo is one of their oldest, longest-running feuds, and the Comanche warriors bristle at the thought that their territory is being encroached upon. The warring between tribes, though often unrecorded, was often fraught with atrocities and horrific losses. The fight for resources and territory was as constant as the battle against the elements and starvation. A vicious, seemingly unbreakable cycle of grievance and vengeance often held rival tribes at odds for decades. Raiding was seen as a cultural pastime, perhaps even a cultural necessity, by most tribes on the continent. It was viewed as a perfectly honorable pursuit to find the nearest village of a longtime enemy and sweep down upon them in a torrent of violence. The killing of males was generally to be expected, but women and children were often not exempt from such horrific, violent ends. Those not killed immediately could expect, at best, to be adopted into the tribe that had just decimated their families. The worst they could expect was a torturous end that would later be spoken of in feared, hushed tones around the campfires of pioneers, Texas Rangers, and Army soldiers. Those raids might come at any time, though generally they slowed during the winter. Should a village be caught unprepared, it could find itself snuffed out by an enemy raiding force, gone as though it never existed. To be sure, this is not to say that intertribal warfare was the only interaction between tribes, as many tribes had long established relationships with their neighbors based on trade and mutual welfare. However, life for all tribes was a continual fight against privation and scarcity, one that created a quite fluid map of tribal territories and loyalties. Tribes like the Crow were driven out by the Sioux, while the Apache were driven from virtually the entirety of Texas by the Comanche. The Navajo, who referred to themselves as Dine, or the people, had long warred with their Apache and Ute neighbors, but even in 1848 still held a particular disdain for the Comanche. The Navajo had descended from the Athabascan-speaking tribes of northwestern Alaska and Canada. Their ancestors, along with the ancestors of the Apache, had come down to what are the present-day states of Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico from their area of shared origin sometime in the late 1400s. They had at first existed as hunter-gatherers, but had adapted the crops and farming techniques of the Pueblo people, who had inhabited the area for centuries. Though their relationship with the Pueblo would also be fraught with contention throughout the years, the Navajo adapted quickly to their new environs by focusing on the production of the three sisters crops of corn, beans, and squash. With the arrival of the Spanish, goats and sheep became common in the American Southwest as they were a hearty protein source that could subsist on the meager grazing options available in the sparse deserts. As the Spanish continued their northward incursion from Mexico in the 1600s and 1700s, they too were subject to the same relationship of intermittent trading and raiding, as were all neighbors of the proud, and powerful Diné people. Meanwhile, in Texas, the Comanche had risen to power after migrating from the northern Rockies as a part of a Shoshone offshoot. Though they had initially been a people decidedly averse to conflict and conquest, this had all changed after meeting the North American continent's most valuable imported animal, the horse. They had ascended to prominence in a matter of decades, and gone from perpetually impoverished to ruthlessly enterprising. In the 1700s, the Comanche had realized the great profits that tribes like the Utes were making in trading slaves to the Spanish as well as other tribes. They had, in fact, united with the Utes for a time and wrought havoc upon the Navajo, the Jicarilla Apache, and the Lipan Apache. These brutal slave raids were carried out with the same ruthless efficiency as were raids for slaves in Africa and South America. Countless times for decades on end, terrified and traumatized people, mostly women and children, would be bargained and bartered for in remote locales on the New Mexico frontier. The Comanche had, in fact, been so feared by the Navajo that the master Spanish diplomat, Juan Bautista de Anza, had used them as an intimidation tactic while bargaining with the Navajo. In early 1786, the Spaniard had managed to, miraculously, come to a peace agreement with the Comanche. Terms were agreed upon that were acceptable to both parties, and a time of peaceable coexistence with the Comanche, a once unthinkable feat but a few years before, began. Only a few weeks after this agreement, de Anza had prudently used his newly minted allies to surprise the Navajo chiefs who had come to visit him to discuss preliminary terms for a potential peace agreement of their own. When de Anza informed the visiting Navajos that the Comanche were now his personal friends, the message to the Navajo was implicit. Should they not agree to halt their own raiding of de Anza's outpost, they could expect a visit from their much-dreaded enemy. Peace terms were subsequently agreed upon, and for a time, a period of socio-political stasis on the southern plains was, at least to some degree, achieved. The Comanche also referred to themselves as the people, in their language, Namernu. They viewed themselves through a lens of unabashed superiority, and their enemies as something less than, worthy of neither pity nor mercy should they intrude upon Comanche land or offend Comanche sensibilities. However, their bloodline is one of the most diverse on record amongst native peoples on the North American continent. This is due to the Comanche penchant for adopting a portion of the captives that they stole. Many times over the preceding centuries, at remote locations on the Texas frontier, families of Tonkawa, Karankawa, Lipan Apache, Mexican settlers, and Texas farmers had been decimated, with their women and children often carried away, never to see their homeland or kinfolk again. Those not sold as slaves to other tribes or New Mexico traders would often end up as fully fledged members of the Comanche. This could be a relatively seamless process with young children who would simply be raised as Comanche. However, oftentimes the process for adoption into the tribe was a harrowing, lengthy, and arduous process. For their first weeks or even months with the tribe, the newly acquired captives would be made to do the least desirable jobs in camp, from cleaning buffalo hides to tending horse herds. This had been the fate of Nautda, the young mother who now lies with her infant, deeply ensconced in this Comanche stronghold in the Wichita Mountains. She had been born in Crawford County, Illinois, in either 1824 or 1825, to Silas and Lucinda Parker. Her birth name had been Cynthia Ann Parker. In 1833, when she was 8 or 9 years old, her grandfather, former Continental Army soldier John Parker, convinced her parents, as well as several other members of the Parker family, to immigrate to Texas. At the time, Texas was in a state of upheaval, awash in chaos and bloodshed. It was 3 years before Texas would win its independence from Mexico and establish itself as an independent republic. However, the cause of the bloodshed was not the warring of principalities, but the incessant raiding of the Comanche. The Parkers were well aware of the raiding, and had constructed a fort to protect themselves against the Comanche attacks. But on the morning of May 19, 1836, when the men were out working in the fields and the gate to the fort was wide open, the Comanche had made their attack. By this time, the Texas War for Independence from Mexico was raging, with the Battle of the Alamo having occurred only a few months earlier. With their two main contenders for Texas engaged in fighting each other, the Comanche were wreaking unfettered havoc on homesteads all across the Texas frontier. What had started out that morning at the fort as a painfully awkward exchange marked by overtures of peace by the Parkers quickly devolved into a massacre in which most of the men in the family were killed and the women and children taken prisoner. Samuel Frost, Robert Frost, Silas Parker, and Benjamin Parker were all cut down and scalped. The 77-year-old John Parker was, in what order we will never know, scalped, emasculated, and killed. The young Cynthia Ann had been taken, along with Elizabeth Kellogg, age 39, John Richard Parker, age 5, Rachel Parker Plummer, age 17, and her baby son James Pratt Plummer, age 1 year, 4 months. James Pratt Plummer would soon be killed by the Comanche due to his inability to keep quiet as they traveled. The unfortunate toddler was summarily disposed of by Comanche warriors roping him and dragging him behind their galloping horses. The rest of the Parker clan would, eventually, be returned to their family, though all would be permanently affected. Cynthia Ann, however, had been taken in by a kindly Comanche woman who cared for her and shielded her from the sights and sounds of the physical, psychological, and sexual traumatization being inflicted upon her aunts at the hands of the Comanche captors. She had been subjected to cruel treatments initially as well, but over time had gradually become accepted by and then adopted into the tribe. Life as a Comanche woman, though, was a seemingly endless succession of chores seen as below the stature of men whose primary roles were as hunters and warriors. While the worst jobs could be outsourced to slaves held by a woman's husband, a Comanche man often also kept multiple wives, as they were seen as little more than homekeepers and childbearers. However, by all available accounts, and by her own later recollections, Cynthia Ann loved her husband, and was very proud of his stature as a warrior and chief. She also loved her newborn boy, whose veins coursed with the blood of both Comanche chieftain and colonial soldier. Now, in her new life as Nautda, she felt protected as part of a great nation of warriors who would defend her and her children with their lives. However, on this night, both mother and child are in grave danger. Lurking in the post oaks surrounding their village are a band of Navajo raiders who have been stalking the village for days. They are the party that had been spotted by the Comanche sentries the day before. They have counted on Peta Nakona and his warriors to charge out of the village to find them and have remained hidden in the hills with the intent of attacking the village once the majority of the warriors had left. In their blind fury, the Comanche have fallen for the ruse, and Peta Nakona and company are miles away. However, the camp is, of course, not left unguarded. But what remains are largely teenage boys, elderly men, and warriors who are injured or otherwise unable to accompany the raiding party. The Navajo raiding party now advances upon the village, riding slowly and deliberately atop their unshod ponies. They are cloaked in darkness and intent on killing any Comanche they can find, and making off with as many of the Comanche's valuable horses as possible. As they advance, they find themselves so close to the village that they can make out the silhouettes of those still awake in their lodges. It is then, however, that the barking of the village dogs alerts the Comanche sentries on guard. These are young teens given the task of standing guard as a precursor to service as a full-fledged warrior, but they are ready and willing to do all that is necessary in defending their homes, families, and possessions. Within seconds, the loud wolf-like howls of the Comanche flood the air, awakening all within the village and sending the remaining able-bodied men flooding out of their lodges. The 16 Navajo are met with a hail of arrows and quickly reconsider their main attack on the village. Instead, the comparatively horse-poor Navajo turn their sights towards the sizable Comanche herd. As a few of the Navajo whirl about the outskirts of the village in order to distract the Comanche, the remainder are able to get away with nearly 200 of the Comanche's horses. Then, almost as quickly as they have appeared, the Navajo are gone, heading southwest at full speed. For the remainder of the night, the Comanche are left to seethe, as riders are sent out to inform Peta Nakona's party of what has occurred. Nautda, meanwhile, has been yet again thoroughly traumatized by a raiding force of natives. Now, as she clasps her newborn tightly and waits on the return of her husband and his cohorts, one can only imagine the mix of terror and righteous indignation swirling in her heart and mind. The life she had so tediously built after the sudden and violent collapse of all she had known as a child had nearly been snuffed out at the blunt end of Navajo war clubs. In a few hours, Peta Nakona and his warriors ride back into the village. After checking on their wives and children, the enraged party heads out on the trail of the Navajo. The fleeing Navajo know they have acquired a sizable bounty in the way of their newly seized horse herd, but the additional 200 animals also present a consequential challenge in slowing the party down drastically. The Navajo have no intention of engaging a full war party in open territory during the daylight hours, and know that their only chance in returning safely with the bounty of their raid is to beat the Comanche back to the safety of Navajo territory. They are, however, no match for the Comanche war party, who are now riding hard over ground they had known since childhood. The Navajo raiders are caught within hours, and 3 are cut down in a storm of Comanche arrows, lances, and tomahawks. The remaining 13 Navajo scatter into the west, leaving their dead comrades and stolen horses to the Comanche. Peta Nakona and his warriors are now in a jovial mood. No Comanche has lost their life at the hands of the intruders, and they have managed to wreak just retribution on their enemies, all while reacquiring their stolen horses. Amidst great glee and whoops of joy and excitement, the Navajo warriors who have been killed are now cut to pieces. As is customary after a victory amongst almost all Plains tribes, the vanquished are marred and eviscerated in hopes that the wounds will be carried into the next life as a reminder of the cost of their misdeeds. Hours later, as the sun begins to fade into the Oklahoma skyline, Peta Nakona leads his warriors back into the Comanche village. He greets his wife Nauta and holds up a long Comanche lance, to the top of which are affixed the 3 freshly taken Navajo scalps. With great joy and relief, the Comanche hold a victory dance. For 4 days, drums are beaten, songs are sung, and fires kept burning. One of the first things that the young son of Peta Nakona and Nauta sees in his initial few weeks in this world is the sight of his father and the other warriors dancing around a large campfire in the middle of the Wichita Mountains, holding high the freshly dismembered scalps of their hated enemies. To the Comanche, it now seems they are untouchable here on the southern plains. They have driven off these intruders just as they had driven off all the others who had seen fit to challenge them for dominion over these invaluable lands. It must have seemed to Peta Nakona that his son, the young Quanah, was destined for a princely life that would see him ascend to a position even more powerful than his father, and to Nauta it must have seemed as though her former life as Cynthia Ann was a world away, something she could forget forever, as she was now part of, and party to, the lineage of the proud Comanche. But the young parents, as it would turn out, are only partially correct. In just over a decade, the world they now know will be overturned entirely. In little more than a year, the Comanche will begin to see a curious outbreak amongst their people. It starts amongst the Penteca, the southernmost and largest band of the Comanche, who live in closest proximity to the white settlements. Then, it begins to spread. The afflicted suffer from severe diarrhea and vomiting, dying of kidney failure and dehydration often within hours of being infected. The disease is known as cholera, and it will go on to kill an estimated half of the Penteca band by the 1860s. The epidemic will go on to devastate not only the Comanche, but virtually every tribe it comes into contact with. Coming on the heels of several devastating smallpox epidemics throughout the early 19th century, the demographic collapse of the lords of the southern plains was all but assured. The Comanche would also be continually pressured by the incessant influx of settlers into the burgeoning Republic of Texas. In the coming decades, they would see their territory encroached upon and taken over until they were relegated to but a small corner of their beloved homelands. Nauta would see her life upended yet again, as Texas Rangers would kill her husband and haul her and her baby off in 1860 to be returned to the Parker family. During this raid, Quanah and his little brother, a boy known as Peanuts, would escape the fighting, never to see their mother again. Quanah, for his part, would go on to become the last great chief of the Comanche, a fierce warrior and skilled diplomat, and a man who seemed perpetually caught between two worlds. But in 1848, All of this seems inconceivable to the joyous band of Comanche as they sing and chant into the night, faces alit by the flames. They are the mighty lords of the southern plains, the Nirmanu, the people, and their downfall is not yet at hand. And so for now, the many tales of the Comanche's reign over the southern plains, as well as the lives and legacies of the Navajo, Texans, Mexicans, and Americans, are all other stories for other times.
January 16, 378 AD. Smoking Frog, a Mayan war chief from the city of Teotihuacan in the Petén Valley region, sat at the front of a war canoe laden with weapons, dried fish, fruit, and additional supplies. Somewhere between 8 to 12 warriors, acting under his command, rowed swiftly, silently, down what is now the Rio San Pedro in western central Mexico. Their intention was to capture the city of Tikal by any means necessary, kill the entire ruling family, and take control of the city themselves. These men, deftly cutting their way down the river through the pre-dawn darkness, were an elite expeditionary force of shock troops whose goal was to overrun the city, kill any and everyone they could until the royal family was captured, then to not only politically take over, but spiritually dominate the city by sacrificing the entire family in a violent blood ritual that would render their spiritual authority over the great metropolis invalid. At this point, it would be a fair question to ask why one city-state of the great Mayan Empire would be attacking another. The Mayan Empire functioned more like ancient Greece than ancient Rome, as there was no central emperor or single city that held primacy over the others. Rather, there was at best a synodal and at worst combative relationship between the numerous city-states that ruled over the various regions in central Mexico. Smoking Frog was a general in this elite force, serving under his ruler, the Teotihuacanos king, Spear Thrower Owl. This fleet of war canoes had been on a relentless blitzkrieg attack for weeks now, and only a little over a week earlier had taken the town of Waka within a matter of hours. But their intended target, the culmination of their southward assault, was Tikal. The massive city, which was home to thousands of Mayan subjects, was ruled by the Emperor Jaguar Paw. But Jaguar Paw and the city-state had gotten out of hand in their aggressive expansion, at least by the measure of Spear Thrower Owl and his cohorts. Expansion in this case meant not only territory, but the building of spiritual power. For the Mayans, of any and all city-states within the overall empire, warfare was not only a terrestrial confrontation, but a metaphysical, spiritual one as well. Their warfare, which would ultimately evolve into what is today known as the Mayan Star Wars, were dependent entirely on divinations from their gods that were derived through a combination of celestial interpretations and blood ritual. When the time was right, according to these interpretations, the Mayan priests would pierce their tongues, lips, and genitals with the spines from stingrays, drawing them entirely through the wound and then catching the blood on a form of parchment they made from bark. This was then burned at a ceremonial altar. This was believed to be a portal to the world of the gods, through which signs could be clearly seen and directions or prophecies discerned. But to really open up the portal to the star gods, the Maya required blood sacrifice of a captured victim. And not just any victim, as not just any blood would do. Though sacrifice of common enemies would surely be pleasing to the star gods, only the sacrifice of royal blood could please them enough to open the celestial portal through which the gods might be directly contacted. For the Maya, this was a matter of life and death, a constant cosmic struggle to please insatiably bloodthirsty and uncompromising gods. Their religion was inseparable from the practicalities of their everyday life, and thus their entire existence depended on the blood sacrifice of the enemies they were able to capture. This is the reason Smoking Frog and his cohort of waterborne warriors were here. And now, as they came around a bend of the river and the smoke began to poke through the dense jungle canopy, the specter of Tikal loomed large in front of them. They carried large, circular, feather-rimmed discs emblazoned with the images of their gods into battle with them, believing that they were not mere representation of these deities, but the actual deities themselves now contained within that object and accompanying them into the fight. They also carried large manatee-hide shields. These were also embedded with obsidian in traditional patterns. When the sun finally did rise, the obsidian flakes would gleam strikingly and terrifyingly in the morning glow. Though the Maya had no form of metal weapons, they carried swords crafted from local hardwoods that were shaped into clubs and then studded with obsidian spikes. Fastened to their belts were shorter daggers and quivers of darts that would be used in the reed blowguns they employed as a first offensive tactic. They carried short stabbing spears akin to wood and obsidian versions of the Ithwik, the short stabbing spear Shaka Zulu and his warriors would employ in their conquest of South Africa centuries later. They also carried throwing spears and atlatls, or spear throwers, which could be used to launch their projectile with magnitudes greater force than the human arm could muster alone. As they neared the city, Smoking Frog reminded his men of their intent and of the promises of the serpent god that they would be victorious. They launched an offensive sortie of darts, arrows, and spears against the city's guards and easily overran the city's civilian population as they stormed their way to the royal palace. After killing the guards there, the royal family was captured, brought out, and according to the Mayan hieroglyphs that would later depict this event, were, quote, made to enter the water, a Mayan euphemism for death and ritual sacrifice. This meant that they were all stripped naked and held over a stone artifice or a rock as the Mayan priest present stabbed into their heaving torso with a jagged obsidian knife, reached into the cavity, grabbed the still beating heart, and ripped it out in one deft motion. The victim would then be decapitated and their heart burned on an altar as a means of opening that vaunted portal between this world and the next. The entire royal family of Tikal, including the king, queen, and children, would suffer this fate. It was believed the more they cried out in pain and fear, the greater the power of the connection to the gods would be. The stone hieroglyph does not depict that battle itself. That we must piece together from accounts of other Mayan raids. It simply shows the new ruler, Smoking Frog, adorned in the warrior headdress of a Teotihuacano, the equivalent of a British redcoat general storming the White House and taking over the presidency under the authority of King George. He wears a large feathered headdress under the symbol of an owl, which is believed to denote his position as a general of the Teotihuacano's king, spear thrower owl. What is certain is that this picture denotes a turning point in Mayan history, one in which the Star Wars would launch into full effect. The next centuries would be laden with countless intra- and intertribal raids that saw countless families broken, villages burned, and captives, men, women, and children alike, made to suffer horrific sacrificial deaths, all to serve an empire that ran on their very blood. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Montana, 1833. From atop one of the two small buildings inside of Fort McKenzie, Prince Alexander Philippe Maximilian Zuvidnevit, renowned German explorer, naturalist, and ethnologist, peers on at a scene that his years of study, travel, and training have still not sufficiently prepared him for. Stretched out before him are hundreds of native warriors, members of the Cree and Assiniboine tribes, replete with their war paint and feathered headdresses. In any other circumstance, the cerebral Deutschman would likely have found himself entranced with the pageantry and spectacle before him. But, on this particular occasion, he feels an eerie dread creep over him. In the quiet still of the oncoming sunrise, the Cree and Assiniboine warriors continue to breach the horizon, pouring towards the fort and, more directly, to the small encampment of Blackfoot men, women, and children camped outside of the fort's walls. The blood feud between the Blackfoot and the Cree, as well as the Cree's allies the Assiniboine, is decades old and viciously deep, though it has gone largely unseen and unrecorded by ethnographers such as Prince Maximilian. The accounts that do exist from survivors of intertribal raiding in the area paint harrowing tales of total warfare, in which men, women, and children alike are cut down or taken captive and made slaves. Countless times on the open plains, a camp of unsuspecting natives has been overtaken in a surprise dawn raid by their rivals and subjected to violent torment and death to the point of near eradication. Oftentimes, the genesis of the conflict involved territorial rights to hunting grounds, which could spell the difference in life and death for bands of wandering nomad tribes. Though the exact cause of this most recent rivalry between the tribes is unknown, the ramifications of the ongoing conflict have echoed across the prairie for years. Were it not for its eventual effect on the fur trade, the conflict may have gone entirely unnoticed by the French, English, and American fur traders who deal so closely with the tribes. It had been the fur trade that had driven the establishment of Fort McKenzie, here in what is the present-day state of Montana. American Fur Company merchant David Mitchell had selected this site 6 miles north of the Marias River in hopes of establishing a central locale from which to conduct trade with local tribes. Mitchell had constructed the fort, comprised of 2 blockhouses inside of a roughly 50-yard by 50-yard square enclosed with a timbered fence, and named it in honor of his boss at the American Fur Company, Kenneth McKenzie. Prince Maximilian and his longtime cohort, famed frontier artist Carl Bodmer, a 24-year-old Swiss-French printmaker, etcher, lithographer, zinc engraver, draftsman, painter, illustrator, and hunter, have spent the past few weeks at Fort McKenzie, making observations and illustrations. Bodmer has already built himself a formidable reputation, and has been in the process of building a rapport with the Blackfoot bands who come to trade at the fort and made camp outside of its walls. Prince Maximilian has also spent considerable time amongst the Blackfoot, building friendships and noting the differences in the several bands of Blackfoot that comprise the larger tribe, as well as its many complex warrior societies. He has, in fact, been the first ethnographer to record these differences, counting there to be 7 men's societies in total, grading by age, with the lowest being the Mosquito Society and the highest being the Bull Society. Other societies included the Bee Society, the Dog Society, the Crow Society, and the Kit Fox Society. Maximilian had also gone to great pains to learn anything of the religion or faith practices of this enigmatic Northern Plains warrior tribe, but in this case, his efforts had proven fruitless, much to his frustration. So much so, in fact, that he had made note of it in his journal. Mr. Berger, the interpreter, who was otherwise well acquainted with the Blackfoot Indians, could not give me any information respecting their religious ideas, further than that they worship the sun. However, while Maximilian and Bodmer had spent the preceding few weeks observing and conversing with the Blackfoot in hopes of furthering their cultural understanding, their compatriot and tireless entrepreneur David Mitchell has spent his time making overtures of goodwill towards the Blackfoot in efforts to establish stronger trading ties and better deals for himself and the American Fur Company. He has, thus far, been rather successful, as the Blackfoot rightfully discern his effort to, at least in some part, be in good faith, as he seems to truly care for and about their people, treating them with respect in all of their prior dealings. Now, a breathless Mitchell scrambles to the top of one of the fort's buildings, joining Maximilian and Bodmer for a better vantage point of the scene about to unfold. Initially, all 3 men are plagued by a sense of foreboding, as it is unclear whether the Cree and Assiniboine's target is the Blackfoot village or the fort. They also share a sense of hopelessness, as their friends and new comrades in the Blackfoot are camped too far away from the fort's walls to enable them to escape the oncoming force of attacking warriors. It is apparent within moments that the attacker's trajectory is directed straight towards the Blackfoot, and that the object of this morning's attack will not necessarily be the raiding of this fort, but the exacting of yet another round of retribution in an ongoing tribal feud. The scene that is about to unfold is one that few white observers have ever been privy to, But the stories of such battles have permeated the local folklore so stringently that the tales of wailing captive slaves, shattered lives, and torture killings are all but ubiquitous here on the northern plains. Now, as nearly all the inhabitants of the fort work to prepare for a residual attack that may still indeed be on its way, most among them lose the internal struggle not to watch the events before them unfold. The Blackfoot, however, do not have the luxury of preparation nor reflection. As the women and children make desperate runs for the fort and the men prepare to make their defensive stand, riders are sent to the nearby, much larger Blackfoot camp located 8 to 10 miles up the Marias River. As the Cree and Assiniboines smash into the smaller Blackfoot camp, a vicious battle unfolds. Many of the women and children who have been unable to flee are cut down in their lodges, the victims of Cree and Assiniboine lances and clubs. The Blackfoot warriors, themselves exhausted from a night of celebratory drinking and dancing, put up a brutal defense of their own, and as the roar of gunfire resounds, and the camp is filled with the shrieks of attackers and victims alike, the fight unfolds in a scene of utter chaos and inhumanity. However, the Blackfoot's staunch defense soon bears fruit, as reinforcements from the nearby Blackfoot camp begin to flood into this camp. In another excerpt from his journal, Maximilian himself recalls the scene in his own words. The reinforcements came galloping in groups, from 3 to 20 together, their horses covered with foam from exhaustion, and they themselves in their finest apparel, with all kinds of ornaments and arms, bows and quivers on their backs, guns in their hands, furnished with their medicines, with their feathers on their heads, and a large hood of feathers hanging down behind, the upper part of their bodies partly naked, and carrying shields adorned with feathers and pieces of colored cloth. The tide of battle shifts dramatically as the Cree and Assiniboine are caught off guard and nearly encircled. The newly arrived warriors, incensed at the attack of their fellow tribespeople, now sweep down upon any enemy warriors they can find, cutting them down with their lances as if they are on a buffalo hunt. Back at the fort, Mitchell and a number of other trappers and hunters have reached their fill of watching Blackfoot women and children, many of whom they have grown close to and know by name, cut down at the hands of Cree and Assiniboine warriors. Laden down with extra ammunition and their own rifles, the small troop of men now floods out of the gates and into the fray of the battle unfolding several hundred yards away. They too sweep down upon the Cree and Assiniboine attackers, firing at will upon any that present themselves as targets. Now, the chaos of the battle only intensifies, as fleeing warriors are cut off and cut down without mercy. Finally, the surviving Cree and Assiniboine flee over the horizon, with this attack having gone awry. Now, a flood of both relief and despair fall over the camp, as loved ones flood back into the village from the fort, many cleaving to the bodies of those who have been killed. Wailing and moaning fill the air, as many of the Blackfoot who had been sleeping peacefully only hours before now find themselves trapped in the midst of seemingly bottomless grief. Then, after an initial wave of sadness has washed over the Blackfoot, the tone changes to one of anger. The dead Cree and Assiniboine warriors lying scattered about the village are now made the target of the Blackfoot's thirst for vengeance. Their bodies are grievously mutilated in the ritual style of plains warfare, with additional indignities being wrought upon their attackers even as they lie still in death. Maximilian himself describes the scene. The men fired guns into the bodies, the women and children beat them with clubs and pelted them with stones, and the fury of the latter was particularly directed against the privy parts. The Blackfoot wounded now also seek refuge and medical assistance inside the fort, which they readily receive. Mitchell and the trappers who rushed out to assist the Blackfoot are now embraced for their efforts as brothers. Even Carl Bodmer is credited by Old Bear Chief himself for preserving his life. The chief believes that, because the artist had painted his portrait mere days before, this had protected him in the battle. Bodmer, for his part, wisely offers no refutation to this. Bodmer will go on to paint a vivid portrait of the battle he has just witnessed, one which captures the diversity in both tribes' weaponry and dress. Though the battle is over, the ramifications will be long-lasting. The tentative peace that had been formally negotiated by David Mackenzie between the Blackfoot and the Assiniboine has been effectively shattered, and the effects will not only be felt here on the high plains, but in the fur markets of the East Coast and Europe. The coming decades will see much change, not only in the dynamics of intertribal relations and the economic consequences that result, but in the actual number of native peoples populating the plains. Though they have already experienced significant damage from diseases such as smallpox and cholera, the coming years will see some tribes on the northern plains suffer mortality rates as high as 50 to 90%. This would change the cultural, demographic, and political landscape of the northern plains and the whole of North America to a degree seldom seen before in human history. However, the tales of the great sorrows suffered on the high plains, as well as the countless tales of bravery, selflessness, camaraderie, and ruthlessness that abound in the history of human conflict, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southern Colorado, 1828. On the sparse expanses of the vast Great Plains, the Comanche chief Bull Hump surveys the dusk landscape. With a discernible glint of excitement in his eyes, he scans the surroundings. His ears listen intently as the younger Comanche warriors whom he has sent out as scouts report their findings to him. And their findings are promising. Only hours earlier, this haughty band of mostly young Comanche warriors had ridden into the area that fur trader William Bent has recently begun constructing and what will come to be known colloquially as Bent's Fort. Bent has been inspired to begin construction on the compound-like area due to its ideal location at the mouth of the Huerfano River. This makes it a hub for local trading activity, and the Comanche, assured in both their growing martial and economic prowess, have strode into the area under the unofficial leadership of Bull Hump, a veteran warrior and affluent trader himself. Though they are notoriously bellicose in nature, the Comanche have spent the preceding few years ensconced in a bitter conflict with their northerly neighbors, the Cheyenne. Though it is generally proffered that the Comanche were relegated to the vast expanses of the southern plains that encompass the area from present-day northern Mexico to Kansas, it is argued by George Bird Grinnell in his work The Fighting Cheyenne that their area of influence, and very likely their area of occupancy during the 1820s, was far wider than understood by present-day ethnographers. He writes, "When the Cheyenne began to work west and southwest from the Missouri River, they found the country occupied by the Kiowas, and the people whom they call, when they are in the mountains, the Shoshone, and on the plains, Skiskini wo Istaniu, or Snake People, the Comanches." The Cheyenne recognize the extremely close relationship which exists between these two tribes of the mountains and the plains, and say that the Shoshone ought to be called mountain snakes or mountain Comanches. The Comanches, they say, range from the Yellowstone River south to beyond the Platte. Grinnell continues, "The wide range of the Shoshone stock on the plains has perhaps not yet been fully appreciated. I believe that at the time of the migration southward of the Blackfeet, the Snakes or the Shoshone occupied much plains territory from the St. Mary's River in Montana and British America southward, perhaps to the Yellowstone. As late as 1840, the mountain Shoshone used to make their war excursions out on the plains of the north, and a war party of them once came as far south as Bent's Fort, where, during a quarrel arising from their insistence that they should be admitted within the fort at an inopportune time, one of them was killed. Some of the writers on the Plains tribes seem not to have understood the close relationship of the Shoshone and the Comanche, and persons who are not aware that the Comanche were reported in the 18th century as ranging in Texas and Mexico perhaps have not realized that people of the same blood and speaking the same language may have lived at the time on the northern plains under another name. A realization of that fact may serve to clear up some apparent confusions. I believe in the matter of the relationships of the tribes who lived about him, the Indian was a much better ethnologist than the early trapper, trader, or missionary who wrote books upon the West, which he had just ventured into, and whose people and products were absolutely new to him. Though the exact date of the first conflict between the Cheyenne and the Comanche is unclear, the reason behind their conflict is, for the most part, easily discernible. This area of the southern plains is not only a central locale for several valuable trade routes, it is a prime territory for the massive buffalo herds whom most plains tribes depend on nearly entirely for their sustenance and survival. By the mid-1820s, Countless bloody, tragic, and terrible atrocities had been wrought on both sides of the conflict in the interest of expansion and, just as significantly, retribution. Now, believing their hated enemy to be somewhere near this current location, Bullhump and his warriors have spent the entire afternoon scouring the area in search of any sign that the Cheyenne might be present. Assured that their enemy is somewhere within the immediate vicinity, Bullhump and several of the more experienced warriors questioned William Bent as to when he had last seen the Cheyenne and from which direction they had come. Bent, doubtless at least slightly intimidated by the potential consequences of his answer, responds that he has seen a sizable party of Cheyenne a few days earlier, coming from the northeast. Bullhump and his cohorts now confer on the best course of action to follow. They all agree that the opportunity to execute a surprise raid on their hated enemy is one that is all but impassable. Not only is there the opportunity for blood debts to be settled, but the economic prize presented by the Cheyenne's sizable horse herd renders their village an irresistible target to the Comanche warriors. After the sun has finally set, a small group of scouts is sent out to determine the exact location of the Cheyenne village. Operating under the cover of darkness, the men soon return, reporting that the village lies only a few miles down the tributary of the Platte River known as Bijou Creek. The camp is too large to merit a head-on attack, a strategy that would lead to needless Comanche deaths. Thus, it is decided that their focus will be on absconding with the sizable horse herd the Cheyenne village has at its disposal. As alluded to in his work Empire of the Summer Moon, author S.C. Gwynn adroitly likens the theft of horses in the Old West to the act of stealing thousands of dollars from a modern-day ATM in one fell swoop. Their intentions now set, the full party of Comanche raiders moves out sometime after midnight, slipping silently across the prairie and creek beds until arriving at the Cheyenne village. Without hesitation, the experienced warriors sneak into place, surrounding the horse herd while taking care not to alert the young Cheyenne boys charged with being on watch. In short order, the air is filled with Comanche war whoops, and hundreds of frightened Cheyenne ponies now charge away from the village, their stampede being directed by strategically placed Comanche cutting off their potential escape routes. Soon, Bullhump and his proud band of Comanche are themselves back in camp, now surrounded by their newly begotten horse herd, and assured that the Cheyenne, now all on foot, have no means with which to pursue them. But, unbeknownst to Bullhump and his warriors, and to William Bent for that matter, the legendary Cheyenne chief, Yellow Wolf, has been away from the large village with a sizable contingent of young warriors. They have been out gathering wild horses, vestiges of the larger population of horses that have been continually working their way northward via trade and migration. Though it is the middle of the night, the warriors are eager to make their way home and intend on arriving near dawn. As they move, one of the warriors near the front of the herd rides back towards Yellow Wolf. He reports that the men at the front all concur that they smell the distinct aroma of burning buffalo chips. The chips, made of dried buffalo dung, are the main source of fire fuel on the timberless plains, and the smell of their smoke is indicative that another tribe is in the area. A contingent of Cheyenne scouts is sent out to investigate, and they return in short order to report that they have found an encampment of several Comanche warriors in possession of what the Cheyenne recognize to be their own horse herd. Yellow Wolf directs a portion of his men to stay with the horses they currently have, while he leads the majority cut off the Comanche's egress southwards onto the plains. The Cheyenne follow their scouts back to the site of the Comanche camp, where Bullhump and his warriors are resting until daybreak before moving their herd of stolen horses again. Yellow Wolf now brings his men to a halt, and directs them to wait until daybreak before making their charge upon the Comanche camp. He instructs the younger warriors, among whom is his beloved stepson, Walking Coyote, to rush upon the horse herd and drive them away from the Comanche and back towards their village. Finally, as the sun breaks the eastern horizon, the Cheyenne make their final approach upon the Comanche camp. They are pleased to see the Comanche who have been on guard of the horse herd throughout the night have momentarily gone into the camp with their cohorts to eat breakfast and prepare for the day's travel. Seeing that the time to strike is now, Yellow Wolf and his warriors advance in silence, walking their horses as close as possible to the camp before erupting in a cacophony of war cries as they drive the horse herd away from the Comanche village and back towards their own. Almost instantly, the Comanche reprisal comes as arrows fill the air, flying towards the Cheyenne. seeing a chance to seize a battlefield honor, Walking Coyote, the stepson of Yellow Wolf, charges back into the very thick of the Comanche encampment where their finest horses had been picketed down for the night. Seeing one particularly fine mount, Walking Coyote jumps from his own horse, cuts the rope picketing the prized horse, jumps back on his own horse, and rides back towards his Cheyenne comrades, leading the new horse away via the rope. When Walking Coyote rejoins his fellow Cheyenne, he triumphantly hands the lead rope of the newly reclaimed horse to his stepfather, Yellow Wolf. But rather than overjoyous pride, the young warrior sees only growing concern in the chief's eyes. Then he looks back himself, to see the Comanche in hot pursuit. The Comanche, mounted on their finest horses, are now approaching at such speed that the Cheyenne are sure to be overtaken. Yellow Wolf now barks out the order that all who have guns must turn back and charge on them. That is the only hope we have of getting away from them. We must fight them. Yellow Wolf being in possession of a fine rifle himself, he leads the charge. Without hesitation, the Cheyenne with guns wheel their horses around, follow their leader in a head-on attack towards the pursuing Comanche. Within moments, they smash into the group of Comanche, numbering about 25 warriors in total, and a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds. Yellow Wolf rides up next to a Comanche warrior, sticks the barrel of his rifle into the warrior's ribcage, and expels the man's innards in a torrent of viscera as he falls to the ground with a thud. Walking Coyote, riding close behind, counts coup on the fallen warrior. As more Comanche begin to fall, a retreat is made, and the pursuing force returns to their cohorts at the main Comanche camp, from which a full retreat is made. The dead Comanche are summarily scalped, and Yellow Wolf affixes the hair of the warrior he has killed on the end of his rifle barrel. The Cheyenne ride back into their camp to the great surprise and adulation of their kinsmen, wives, and children. The Cheyenne camp, awash only hours before in hopelessness, is now a site of great revelry, as the people have gained back not only their stolen horses, but the newly gotten wild horses and the Comanche mounts as well. In 1840, a peace would be made between the Cheyenne and the Comanche, and Bull Hump would recall the raid and explain that he and his warriors had believed, quite rightly, the Cheyenne would be heading back to their camp, and seeing as how the Cheyenne camp was now a far more formidable target, they had chosen to fight another day. Such was the way of warfare on the plains, a highly mobile, fluid, and violent affair with battles that took place countless times throughout history, the vast majority of which have gone unrecorded. And while you can rest assured that there are many other accounts of intertribal warfare on the open plains, those, for tonight, are other stories for other times. July 9th, 1755. Just after crossing the Monongahela, General Braddock's forces of 1,300 men traveled into a waiting ambush by a force of 900 French-Canadian and native warriors. In a battle tantamount to an hours-long bloodbath, General Braddock, along with 900 of his men, would end up as casualties that day, over half of which would not survive the retreat to Philadelphia. The Braddock expeditions, a multi-pronged strategy to drive back New France from the Ohio country and other British colonial interests, faded away just as soon as it had begun. The British Empire and her colonies were in crisis. If they couldn't rally from the depths of this defeat and mount a successful offensive campaign, large swaths of North America would be forever lost to the French. While the prospect of losing an imperial war to the French was on the minds of the ruling class in London, the now undefended backcountry brought more pressing concerns to the settlers of western Pennsylvania and the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. The lack of a colonial force emboldened hostile native tribes to raid, pillage, and plunder settlements in the Ohio Valley and beyond. With settlers running back across the Blue Ridge Mountain to establish towns, Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sought to take action. Before the end of July, 35 settlers from Virginia had already been reported killed. George Washington, who had by all accounts performed most admirably during the Battle of Monongahela, even after incurring 4 bullet holes through his uniform by the end of the fight, was left unharmed. Dinwiddie offered Washington full command of the Virginia military with a commission to enlist and train men to operate as a security apparatus against native raiders. Pennsylvania, where the vast majority of the Ohio country in question was located, could not formulate an effective strategy as quickly. With ongoing attacks on settlers taking place, the Quakers raised £1,000 to be put towards buying weapons for the frontiers people, but it would be a meager attempt to quell the confrontations. Before the disaster on the Monongahela had even occurred, on June 2nd, a New England regiment had sailed to the Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia, as a function of the Braddock expedition's northern campaigns. On June 16th, a large shell cannon shot from the New Englanders struck Fort Beauséjour, killing 6 French officers inside. The French surrendered the fort at once. This would be the first offensive victory in colonial Britain in this young war, and it happened with a surprising degree of ease. What followed would have long-term ramifications for the native Acadian population, who had lived an agrarian life and gone about practicing their Catholic faith that they had adopted from the French. The Acadians were then stripped of their land, and some 11,500 of them were displaced, shipped to the British colonies down the coast, and some relocated to Europe. They would also be stripped of their right to practice their faith, and many would act as an insurgent force, funneling arms and intelligence to their French brethren throughout the conflict. William Johnson, a native of Ireland who had moved to New York at a young age to manage an estate that had been purchased by his uncle, was tasked with directing one of the northern campaigns of Braddock's plan. He would head directly north in August of 1755 on the Crown Point expedition. He would rename Lac Saint-Sacrement as Lake George. Johnson would begin construction on Fort William Henry at the southern end of the lake, to be used as a staging area against the French. The French had built Fort St. Frederick, near Lake Champlain, just north of Lake George. This would set the stage for another empirical clash in just a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, in Albany, William Shirley was to head west through Pennsylvania to Fort Oswego with his force of over 1,000 men. Shirley was the sitting governor of Massachusetts Bay, and his involvement had been planned as a critical part of the Braddock expeditions. He was to travel north to Fort Niagara and lay siege to it, but along the route he had learned of Braddock's demise and the disastrous results of the Monongahela. Making matters far worse for Shirley was that his son had been serving under Braddock and had been killed in action at Monongahela, shot through the head. Johnson and Shirley had bitter feelings towards one another. Johnson had sent a letter to London that Shirley was not fit for command, citing that he was emotional and reckless. Braddock's orders gave Shirley only a vague command over Johnson, and he would have difficulty getting Johnson to execute his orders. Both men's campaigns would be completely without logistical support from the regular army, leaving their provincial forces to fend for themselves. Shirley learned that the plans for the entire strategy implemented by Braddock were found among the battlefield dead by the French. Fort Niagara would be well aware of the reason Shirley and his men were traveling west. Shirley was caught between a proverbial rock and a hard place as, to further complicate his circumstances, 50 miles to the north there were a contingent of native and French forces at Fort Frontenac. If Shirley were to carry on with his plans for Niagara, the French and natives could swoop down and take hold of Fort Oswego, trapping Shirley and his men in between themselves and Niagara, and cutting them off from all supply lines and reinforcements. Shirley held a council of war with his officers of Fort Oswego, and determined it best to forego the Niagara campaign. He left 700 gravely undersupplied men to hold the fort throughout the winter. Then he headed east to New York City. There, Shirley would take over his new role as commander-in-chief for the deceased Braddock, and begin working on raising money and war planning for the upcoming spring campaigns. French allied native forces would take Fort Oswego the following spring, before the snow even had a chance to melt. August 16th saw the arrival of Dieskau at Fort St. Frederick. They had marched from Montreal in 3 columns, and after establishing his headquarters at Crown Point, he took inventory of the men. 550 men within the fort, along with 1,000 regulars, 1,400 Canadians, and 600 natives, making their camp near the structure. Dieskau would take issue with the natives who had joined his force, writing, "I encountered nothing but difficulties from the Indians. Never was I able to obtain a faithful scout. At one time, they refused to make any headway. At another time, seeming to disobey me, they set forth and returned within days without bringing me any intelligence." He would instead rely on the Canadians for intel, and on August 27th, word came to him that, quote, 3,000 Englishmen were camped at Fort Lyman, where they were constructing a fort that was pretty well advanced. The presence of Johnson's army was not entirely a surprise to him, as having learned of Braddock's plans, he had anticipated Johnson would march north from Albany. What he did not expect, however, were the sheer numbers of the force under Johnson's command. On September 1st, as the French army contingent moved out, Dieskau was adamant that were Johnson planning to attack, it would happen on the battlefield before they could arrive at Crown Point. Just 3 days later, Dieskau received intel from a scouting party of Abenaki. They had captured a member of New York's 1st Regiment. During his interrogation, he was extremely forthright with Johnson's plans. He would tell his captors that Johnson had moved 3,000 Provincials and Mohawk warriors to Lake George and left 500 men back at the fort to finish its construction and serve as its defense. This intelligence brought Dieskau to take decisive action. He gathered 1,500 of his men, roughly half of whom were French-Canadian and the other half native warriors, most of whom were either Abenaki or Nipissing. They sailed down Lake Champlain. Then, after landing at South Bay, the French commander took great caution with his overland movement, as the men avoided Wood Creek Road, which would be patrolled with colonial British scouts, and instead opted to cut their own path through the woods, hacking away trees and brush as they charted their path ahead in concealed fashion. After 2 days, they had completed a march of over 30 miles, a journey that had in its own right been no easy task. The plan was for them to scatter and deliver a brutal surprise attack against the British colonials from all sides. Through the night, they advanced in darkened columns, but when the columns became lost in the woods and a wrong direction was taken by the Caughnawaga native who was guiding them, a distraught Dieskau called off the planned assault. A French general proposed advancing the attack during a council of war he had called while still in the woods. Yet this time, he was rebuked by many of the natives, offering up a variety of reasons for their change of heart. A further agitated Dieskau could not convince them, and he knew any offensive without their assistance would be futile. As their options were assessed, it was decided that they would forego attacking Fort Lyman and would instead stage an assault on Johnson's camp directly. Meanwhile, Johnson had spent the afternoon discussing the size of the new fortification with his officers, but the topic at hand quickly changed when a group of Mohawk scouts returned to camp with some startling news. The scouts had uncovered tracks leading away from the shoreline at South Bay. The warriors made their way to the Wood Creek Road, but were surprised to find no sign of the men. Returning back to South Bay to investigate further, they came upon 3 crudely made roads that led through the woods. It became apparent that Dieskau was moving his forces on Fort Lyman, yet without the Mohawks actually seeing them, their size could not be accurately assessed. Johnson sent a dispatch to Joseph Blanchard at Fort Lyman, warning him of the impending attack. The rider, a New York wagoneer named Jacob Adams, dashed off, getting within a couple miles of the fort when he found himself in the midst of the French camp. Adams was instructed to halt and dismount his horse. He ignored these calls and carried on attempting to break through. The French opened fire, and after Adams was knocked from his steed, the dispatch was found on his person. A group of Mohawks who had heard the events returned later that evening to Johnson's camp with their account of what had taken place. Quote, "Gunfire, and then a man called upon heaven for mercy. They judged the man to be Adams." Now, the clandestine chess match between Johnson and Dieskau would finally come to a head. Johnson called another council of war early the next morning, September 8th, and it was decided to send out a single column of 1,200 men composed of Nathan Whiting and the 2nd Connecticut, Ephraim Williams and the 3rd Massachusetts, along with the front of the column being led by 170 Mohawk warriors under the highly revered Mohawk Valley chief King Hendrick. They were to march south to relieve Fort Lyman. The events that follow would come to be known as the Bloody Morning Scout. Leaving at around 8 that morning, the single column would march 5 to 6 men wide along the road for half a mile before coming to a halt to allow the trailing Connecticut men to catch up. During this break, Chief Hendrick would famously turn to Williams and state in a blunt and matter-of-fact tone, quote, "I smell Indians." The warrior then rode back to the head of the column, and the march carried on. Several miles ahead, at roughly 10 that morning, a scouting party reported to Baron de Dieskau that they had located the colonial and native column traveling toward Fort Lyman. Dieskau then gave the orders to his men to move out, with the Canadians on the right, the French regulars in the center, and St. Pierre and the natives under his command on the left. Dieskau's plan was to form an envelopment for the Colonials to walk into. He gave strict instructions to his flanking commanders not to allow any fire upon the men until he gave the orders, out of concern that they would let loose early and their enemy would retreat before his forces were able to inflict the decisive blow. The primary concern for Dieskau was his native warriors. His dissatisfaction with their intelligence reports, as well as his inability to convince him to follow his orders to attack the fort, gave him doubt about how the morning's events would transpire. Now with his men in place, As Dieskau's army waited in absolute silence for the coming envoy, no one was to move until the Colonials were within musket fire of the French grenadiers located front and center of the road. At 10:30 that morning, the fevered anticipation would finally cease, as the discharge of a single musket firing cried out through the silence of a hushed morning. While it's still debated who delivered this opening shot, the next moment saw a flood of gunfire unleashed from all parties. Dieskau would refer to this as, quote, the moment of treachery, doling the blame upon his native warriors for firing early. Nevertheless, the battle was now underway. The onset of the clash painted an eerily similar picture to Monongahela, with the forward column of Mohawks being ruthlessly cut down, and the Massachusetts regiment behind them faring little better. Furthering the chaos and disorder of the Mohawks was the shocking death of their beloved Chief Hendrick. This sent many of the native warriors under his command retreating back up the road through the Massachusetts regiment, many of whom broke ranks and joined the natives in their retreat. Those who stayed showed an unshakable resolve, returning fire as best they could amidst the storm of musket balls and shouts, but they were rewarded for their courage only by being cut down in droves. Colonel Williams attempted to rally his men, waving his sword above his head and barking out orders. He rode to the top of a boulder, ordering them to hold their position, when, just as quickly as the words could pass through his lips, a musket ball sliced through his skull, dropping him stone dead at once. His body was hidden under heavy brush by his men to save it from mutilation, but the effect of his loss was catastrophic. Multitudes of men broke ranks and began fleeing back towards Johnson's camp. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Whiting and the 2nd Connecticut were all that remained, but charging forward into Dieskau's snare would be futile. The quick-thinking Whiting ordered the retreating Mohawks and Massachusetts within earshot, as well as the 500 men of his regiment, to form in lines on the edges of the road, taking cover under stone or brush as the terrain saw fit, and stave off the pursuing enemy in a fighting retreat. Given the desperate circumstances and the relatively novice-level training of many of the provincials, the move would be executed in a surprisingly flawless manner. For the better part of the next hour, the Colonials fought on, and simultaneously dashed their way back towards their camp. The tables had been turned, and due to the overzealous chase by the Franco-Allied forces, the pursuing forces would be cut down in great numbers as they pressed after their retreating foe. Many of the native warriors fighting on the side of the French fled into the woods upon the realization of the counterattack taking place. Lieutenant Colonel Seth Pomeroy, who seconded the strategy of the fighting retreat, spoke of the cunning withdrawal. Quote, "We killed great numbers of them. They were seen to drop like pigeons." Jacques Legardeur de Saint-Pierre, the commander of the French, Canadian, and native forces, was among those slain in the engagement, causing much dismay and further straining the already fraught relations Dieskau held with his native warriors. Just before noon, Whiting's maneuver had the men just within a mile of Johnson's camp, when at last the provincials turned and set upon an all-out sprint for survival towards the encampment. Nathan Whiting had saved more than just the lives of many of his men that day. He also saved Britain from a sequel to the disaster on the Monongahela, and it is likely that he preserved New York from having New France march upon Albany. Upon the arrival of the surviving men back to camp, General Johnson immediately called for every defensive measure to be taken, but the crude defenses his army had been able to construct around his camp would do little to quell the oncoming French onslaught. Johnson ordered cannons and artillery to be brought forward and aimed towards the road, and wagons to be overturned as makeshift breastworks. He then instructed his men to steel themselves for what would be a horrifically violent culmination to the Battle of Lake George. But the many tales of bravery and butchery that compile the saga of the French and Indian War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. West Texas, November 1855. As the cool autumn wind whips around them, a large party of Comanche men, women, and children make their way northeast through the barren country, on their way to the seasonal roaming territory of their most important source of sustenance, the huge herds of American bison, or buffalo, that roam the Great Plains. Though their austere surroundings would be enough to drive almost any mortal being to the brink of endurance, the Comanche seem wholly unbothered as they plod their way across the open prairie. One among their party, however, is visibly bedraggled by the incessant pace, an omnipresent cloud of dust stirred up by the Comanche horses and mules. He is a captive of the Comanche, taken as a human spoil of war in their ongoing conflict with the Texas Rangers and cattle ranchers who ventured out further onto the frontier with every passing year. His name is Nelson Lee. Only months prior, he had been a member of a group of enterprising horse traders who had been making the treacherous journey to Southern California to sell their vast herd of valuable horses and mules at a markedly higher price than they might garner in Texas, Louisiana, or east of the Mississippi. The party of 27 men had been set upon by the Comanche, and only Nelson Lee, William Akins, Thomas Martin, and Jonathan Stewart had managed to survive. Akins and Lee had been forced to watch as Martin and Stewart were subjected to vicious, hours-long torture killings at the hands of the Comanche. They had then been divided up amongst the war chiefs, and Lee had been designated as a slave to the renowned warrior Spotted Leopard. Lee will be relegated to the menial tasks of completing chores in camp, as well as the gory, stinking work of skinning and gutting the hulking buffalo that are harvested. His only hopes for survival are to comply with his captors in the Comanche. Though the nearly unbearable pangs of loneliness and isolation incessantly tear at his psyche, Lee's experience is not entirely unique on the Texas frontier. For decades now, across the whole of central Texas, entire families have been killed or carried off, and entire farmsteads laid waste to by Comanche raiders intent on driving out any and all intruders from their hard-won lands. This policy is not necessarily driven as much by racial motives as it is by cultural ones, as the Comanche reserve the same treatment for any and all of their enemies, be they Anglo-Texans, Tejanos, Mexicans, Americans, Spanish, or members of rival tribes like the Tonkawa, Caddo, and Cheyenne. The Comanche have risen to prominence in this harsh land after migrating southward from the northern ranges of the Rocky Mountains after acquiring the horse in the 17th century. In the ensuing time period, they had swept through the southern plains and wrested virtually the whole of Texas from the control of perhaps their most hated enemy, the Apache. Though the vast majority of their encounters on the open expanses of the frontier have gone unrecorded in the annals of Western posterity, the results of the sheer brutality of this conflict were on clear display to the Spanish friars who inhabited the Catholic mission of San Saba, near today's town of the same name. Here, the resident priests saw what amounted to veritable hordes of Apache fleeing into the confines and comparative safety of the mission walls, in search of salvation from the incessant attacks of the Comanche. The Apache, too, have unleashed countless attacks on Comanche villages, killing men, women, and children, and taking any spoils and captives that they could. This cycle of violence is also not at all unique to the southern plains, but what is about to take place will be one of the few glimpses garnered by captive sources of the brutal realities of intertribal warfare. Unbeknownst to this Comanche band now traveling through these vast expanses, a group of Apache, also out on a hunting trip in hopes of fortifying their stock of meat for the winter ahead, is in the immediate vicinity. As the Comanche band, traveling in a group spread out over roughly a quarter of a mile, makes their way through a short expanse of hills and streams that dots the otherwise flat country, both parties are woefully unaware of the other's presence. The Comanche's extended traveling line is bookended by their group of pack mules in the back and a younger group of warriors to the front who dash back and forth playfully as the rest of the party plods away. Lee and Spotted Leopard ride near the rear, near the mules. Though he is still figuratively bound in the role of a captive slave, for the first time in many weeks, Lee is able to enjoy relatively unfettered movement as his limbs are left untied in order to enable him to work. He even has some measure of assurance that, as the Comanches have not yet killed him as they had his companions, he might even be able to someday become an adopted member of the tribe, an incredibly rare circumstance for any fighting-age male prisoner. For a brief moment, Lee is able to afford himself a psychological reprieve from his current plight. Then, suddenly, the warriors near the front of the procession become visibly animated, some of them dashing back towards Spotted Leopard, and some making their way to the crest of a hill to their immediate left. The cry goes up from the young warriors at the front of the line. The Apache have been spotted, and an attack is underway. Now, there is no time to waste. The lives of every single member of this party of Comanche, including not only their prisoners, but their women and children, are now in immediate danger. The word travels to every warrior that the Apache are approaching from the opposite side of the hill to their left, and the men all now scramble to form a battle line atop the hill in order to receive the oncoming Apache charge. In his autobiography entitled 3 Years Among the Comanche, a narrative of a Texas Ranger, Nelson Lee gives his first-hand account of the beginning of the battle. The whole band dashed upon the hill, except for Spotted Leopard and myself, who remained with the mules in the rear, and on reaching the summit, deployed into the line. By this time, I heard the cry of, "The Apaches! The Apaches!" and knew at once there was hot work at hand. As yet, however, I had seen nothing of an enemy, and only drew the inference that there was one present from the cries that I had heard, and the general commotion that prevailed. In the course of 2 or 3 minutes after our line was formed on the ridge, the air was rent with the noise of the war whoop, and up the opposite ascent, at full speed, came the Apaches in a solid body like a black cloud. As they approached, a shower of arrows were discharged from both lines. Then, they rushed upon each other in a hand-to-hand encounter. A vicious fight now unfolds, as the Comanche warriors know that they are the only line of defense between the attacking Apache and their own women and children. Though firearms are certainly not uncommon amongst native frontier tribes by this time in the 1850s, they are not possessed by a great many warriors on either side in this case. Thus, the combat at hand entails up-close and personal encounters fought with spears, clubs, shields, hatchets, and knives. The bloody, violent conflict unfolds with shocking speed and intensity, with the only rules of engagement being victory by any means necessary. The cries of the vanquished and the exhortations of the victors resound about the battlefield, seeming to drown out any and all other sounds in the vicinity. Lee's personal account of the battle continues. From the position I occupied, I had a fair unobstructed view of the battle. It was fierce and terrible. The horses reared and plunged and fell upon each other, their riders dealing blow for blow, and thrust for thrust, some falling from their saddles to the ground, and others trampling madly over them. The Comanches outnumbered the enemy. Nevertheless, they were forced to retreat, falling back down the hill almost to my position. But still, they were not pursued, the Apaches appearing to be content to hold possession of the ground. Soon, the tribe of Spotted Leopard again rallied and dashed once more back into the attack. If possible, this contest was severer, as it was longer than the first. Again, the first blow was given and returned. Again, horses and men intermingled in melee, stumbled, fell, rolled upon the ground, while the wide heavens resounded with their hideous shrieks and cries. My blood thrilled through my veins as I looked upon the scene. I had mingled in encounters fierce even as that, but never before in the midst of the hottest fight was I overcome with such a sense of terror. To be an inactive spectator of a battle is far more painful than to be a participator in it. As the Apache warriors continue their onslaught, and the Comanche fight to defend their families, Lee struggles with the odd dichotomy of his situation as the lone captive observer. His account continues. I hoped devoutly during the engagement that the Comanches would be beaten, being impressed with the belief that if I should fall into the enemy's hands, my chances of escape would be increased, for I had often heard that the Apaches, though a most warlike nation, were more merciful to their prisoners than others of their race. But in this, I was disappointed. The Apaches at length gave way, disappearing beyond the ridge. Instead of pursuing their advantage, however, the Comanches hastily gathered up their dead and retreated towards the mountains we had crossed. As soon as they had left the ground, the Apaches again appeared upon the height and bore away their dead. It was a drawn battle. The Comanche have lost 17 of their own warriors in the fight, with Lee's account estimating that the Apache have likely lost approximately twice that number. The Comanche now commence with the unenviable task of burying their dead, as well as tending to their wounded. Amidst the carnage and sorrow, Lee recounts the Comanche approach to this grisly endeavor. The close of this eventful day was occupied in burying the slain, which ceremony was performed in their customary manner, except they seemed to chant the death song with more energy and feeling than on ordinary occasions. With them, death, at any time, even of the nearest and dearest of their kindred, is not regarded as an event to be deplored, but on the contrary, to be welcomed with rejoicing. But when a warrior dies on the field of battle, their joy and exultation knows no bounds, for their crude theology assures them that his departed spirit is, at once, caught up by the Great Spirit and borne to the region of everlasting and supreme felicity. After the dead are buried, the Comanches' lives, and their hunt for food, must continue. The band makes their way to their seasonal hunting grounds, seeing no more of the Apache along the way. Here, they will remain for 2 months, harvesting buffalo and camping on the open plains. By the next spring, a peace with the Apache will be struck. With the ever-increasing encroachment of American and Mexican settlers into their territories, the two tribes come to view a partnership affording each some form of mutual protection as a far better option to the continued intertribal slaughter. For his part, Lee will eventually escape and go on to continue his adventurous life on the Texas frontier for years to come, ultimately succumbing to an undisclosed illness in New York City on December 21, 1871. But the many tales of brutal intertribal warfare and unyielding violence between settlers and the native tribes of the American frontier, as well as the countless tales of conflict and combat from Nelson Lee's personal account of his life and times in Texas are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Spring, 1820, in what is today Wyoming. In the waning hours of the late afternoon, a group of Cheyenne warriors prowled the area like hungry wolves. They were a small scouting party in search of a large camp of their hated enemies, the Crow. They had traveled many miles through hard country in order to be there that evening, in hopes of garnering themselves great measures of wealth, riches, and revenge. The entire Cheyenne nation, in fact, had been making its way to this territory in search of the Crow. Even in 1820, the two tribes had been warring for generations. And while the exact genesis of the conflict has been lost to history, it is a relatively safe assumption that it began, at least in part, as a conflict over resources and territory. The northern plains are a terribly unforgiving place, with scorching summers and famously long and blustery winters. The fight for survival for any and all plains tribes was a very real day-to-day battle against elements and scarcity, and this inevitably led to conflicts. One killing would beget a retributory raid, which would beget another retributory raid, all of which were awash in the blood of many men, women, and children. This was an unforgiving world, and divisions ran deep and were not often quickly forgotten. Such was the case with the Cheyenne and the Crow. The year prior, in 1819, the Crow had killed 30 Cheyenne who were attempting to raid their camp for horses. Now, being the most recently aggrieved party in this cycle of generational violence, the Cheyenne were on the move northwest, to the lands traditionally controlled by the Crow. A large camp of Crow had been reported by scouts to be located on the Tongue River, a tributary of the Yellowstone River located in present-day Wyoming and Montana. The Cheyenne made camp a number of miles away on the Powder River and sent their warriors, who by this time had also linked up with a number of Teton Sioux warriors who were thirsting for revenge on their longtime Crow enemies as well, out to scout the area in hopes of engaging, raiding, and killing as many Crow as possible. However, this initial foray into the high plains and foothills of the area had left them empty-handed. As night began to fall, the Cheyenne and their Teton Sioux allies made their way back to their home camp, perhaps slightly sheepish at their lack of initial success, but still highly confident that they were within striking distance of their desired target. But upon returning to the village, they were met with the news that the Crow were indeed in the area. This must have simultaneously stirred up great excitement as well as a pang of dread. A Crow hunting party had come upon the Cheyenne village, but upon seeing the size of it, had decided to marshal a larger force of their cohorts before returning to attack. The Crow had been spotted, but made their escape over the hilltops and out of sight before the scouting party of Cheyenne had returned. Now, the clock was ticking on a deadly game. As the Cheyenne scouting party made its way back into the camp, they were greeted with a flurry of activity. Time was of the essence, as it was clear that the camp of Crows was, at least momentarily, bereft of a sizable portion of their young warriors and chiefs, and that a Crow attack was all but imminent. The Cheyenne had to make their attack and subsequent escape now, or they would risk not only missing their chance to raid the essentially defenseless village, they would likely soon be overrun themselves when the Crow returned with a larger force. This was an incredibly dangerous situation for all involved, but the Cheyenne and Teton Sioux allies decided that the risk must be taken, or this trip so far into enemy territory would be for no tangible gain. A sizable force of younger warriors was left to protect the camp should the Crow attack come before the raiding party could return, and the women and children of the village broke down the camp and made it ready to move. Now, the race was on to raid the Crow village and get out of Crow territory before being found and almost certainly killed themselves by a large, vociferous force of Crow warriors. The raiding party headed out in the wee hours of the morning, following the trail the Crow had left on their egress. At just about noon, with a high plains sun belting down from straight overhead, the Cheyenne and Teton Sioux force came upon the Crow village. After an initial scouting foray reported the village had indeed been left with few warriors who posed a viable threat, no time was wasted. The Cheyenne and Sioux swept down upon the Crow village of roughly 100 lodges in a storm of violence and bloodshed. They rode into the village, clubbing down any men, women, or children who posed any measure of resistance. Arrows flew, war clubs thudded down, and the screams of the vanquished abounded. Once all resistance was neutralized, anything of value that could be carried, from cookware to blankets to weaponry, was rapidly strapped to the Crow horses being stolen and made ready for rapid travel over brutal country. Their plunder also included human beings. Women and children who were not killed were bound, strapped horseback, and as they wailed and moaned over their new fates as captives, marched off over the hills, never to see their homes again. But the ordeal, for all involved, had only just begun. The Crow raiding party was roaming the area, and now the Cheyenne had to get back to their own village as fast as possible to make their escape to the southeast and onto the open plains. This was, of course, now made an even more cumbersome task with the added burden of their plunder and prisoners. While the Cheyenne and their Sioux cohorts were indeed flush with the thrill of victory, a new sense of dread overtook the group as the party lumbered its way back into the Cheyenne camp. These were not the only Crow in the area, only a singular encampment, thus the Cheyenne feared the Crow might have been able to marshal quite a sizable force that might be able to overtake the security elements they had left behind. After a few hours of this, consternation had grown within the ranks of the Cheyenne and the Sioux. The pace was too slow, some said, and they were losing precious time in escaping and evading the Crow. Others were complaining that the approximately 100 captives they had taken were not being divvied up evenly between the Cheyenne and the Sioux. A heated discussion ensued, which turned into an argument. Then, an agreement was reached. A number of the weaker, younger, or slower prisoners were summarily untied, yanked off their horses, and either drilled with arrows or clubbed to death as their friends and family members, already thoroughly traumatized by the day's events, were made to watch. Their bodies were left where they fell, to be fed upon by the wolves and buzzards, and the party moved out again, this time at an even more exhaustive pace. One can only imagine the despair the Crow must have felt. The women among them would, for all intents and purposes, be made into slaves. The children would likely be adopted into the tribe that had murdered their families. Either way, none of their lives would ever be the same again. They would eventually reach the Cheyenne village that had been made ready to move out. Several more days of hard travel, cruel treatment, and minimal food and shelter would follow until they reached the relative safety of the Cheyenne hunting grounds. The Crow raiding party was in hot pursuit, now burning for revenge after discovering the charred remains of their village and loved ones. And though they would ultimately fail to rescue their loved ones from the Cheyenne on this particular occasion, this was by no means the end of the hostilities between the two tribes. Raids and counter-raids between the two would carry on for decades, with the events of Tongue River in 1820 being oft cited as a large motivating factor for the Crow. In fact, The Crow were so generationally incensed by the massacre at Tongue River, they would refuse to become allies with the Cheyenne and Sioux, even against the U.S. Army during Red Cloud's War in the 1860s. The intertribal politics of North America, both pre- and post-contact with the Old World, in large part set the foundation for their interactions with subsequent settlement attempts. The tales of raids and counter-raids, violence and vengeance in the history of the American West are too countless and too consequential to cover in one episode. But rest assured, those are other stories for other times.
Southwestern Texas, autumn, 1838. On the banks of the Pecos River, a hunting party of Delaware native tribesmen and a lone Texas ranger relax in their camp, taking in the scenery and fine weather. The Texas Rangers as an organization and the Delaware have built up a close relationship over the preceding years, having the mutual interest of stemming the tide of violence being wrought over the whole of the Texas frontier by the fearsome and formidable lords of the southern plains, the Comanche. The Delaware warriors are members of a long-displaced Algonquin descendant people who had once inhabited the lands ranging from southern New York to the present-day state of Delaware. Though they refer to themselves as the Line-Lape or common people, they have come to be known as Delaware, as their first encounter with European settlers came on the banks of a bay named in honor of Lord de la Warr, governor of the English settlement at Jamestown in the year 1610. In the succeeding centuries, the Delaware have been driven southwest, first to the Ohio River Valley, with some moving to Missouri in the late 18th century. Members of this tribe eventually made their way south to Texas, where they had assimilated into many East Texas locales with the local Caddo tribe. They existed peaceably with Mexican officials and citizens, as well as their Texas successors. Their shared interest in combating the Comanche threat had garnered them several close friendships with the Rangers and among the surveyor parties who existed under the perpetual threat of a torturous, violent end at the hands of the Comanche. The ranger here in camp today, accompanying this party of 18 Delaware warriors, is 21-year-old John Coffee Hayes, better known as Jack Hayes. Having moved to Texas only the year prior, Hayes has already cultivated a reputation as a steadfast gentleman and a hellacious combatant. Hayes hails from the woods of Tennessee, the product of a military family. His father had served under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812, and he had been named after Jackson's famous Brigadier General, John Coffee. When he arrived in Texas in 1837, he carried with him letters of recommendation from family who had close ties to then President of Texas, Sam Houston. Though his arrival saw him miss out on the preeminent events of the Texas Revolution, young Jack Hayes has spent the previous year inexorably ensconced in combating the true biggest threat on the Texas frontier, the Comanche. The Comanche, a Shoshone offshoot who wandered down to Texas from the northern Rockies, had acquired horses from the Spanish in the 1600s and quickly became masters of the new animal and its potential. Though they had started out as a perpetually beleaguered people, subject to the violence and oppression of rival tribes, the introduction of the horse saw the Comanche rapidly ascend to primacy on the vast expanses of the southern plains. Their unique brand of whirlwind violence was not wrought upon Europeans alone, as tribes like the Apache, the Lipan Apache, the Wacos, and the Tarankawas suffered losses just as prevalent and as gruesome as their Spanish, American, French, and Mexican counterparts. This shared suffering led to alliances on the Texas frontier that many contemporary observers would view as unlikely. Such is the case with the young ranger in camp today on the Pecos River. His counterparts in the Delaware warriors accompanying him are not only allies, but close and trusted friends. Though large parts of their time are spent patrolling the areas west of San Antonio and Austin in search of raiding parties of Comanche, they have made this trip to the Pecos River, far west of the only notable settlements, purely in the interest of recreation. Their hope is to procure some of the bountiful game of the area, from bison to white-tailed deer, bear, bobcats, jaguars, and antelope. Hayes and his comrades have so far spent this day lounging about camp, taking their rest from the long journey they had made from San Antonio. A journey they had made on foot, in hopes of keeping a lower profile and not traveling with a large horse herd that might prove more enticing to the Comanche than a small hunting party. The men congregate about the camp, checking their gear, trading jokes, or, in some cases, napping in the shade. The only ones among this party who seem eager to explore their new surroundings are two of the younger Delaware braves, who make their way downriver in hopes of taking stock of the local game and topography. Thus far, the day has been a welcome reprieve from the often unyielding stress of life on the Texas frontier, deep in the heart of what was known to the Spanish as Comanche. Suddenly, though, this placid riverside campsite scene is shattered as the cries of one of the young Delaware warriors is suddenly heard above the sounds of quiet conversations and trickling water. The young man sprints into camp, covered in blood, breathlessly explaining how he and his Delaware comrade had been surprised by the Comanche. His friend is dead, he says, and he is lucky to have escaped with his life. He informs the men in the camp that the Comanche raiding party is now headed south, likely towards Chihuahua, Mexico. A vote is taken up amongst the Delaware, and it is unanimously decided that the hunt will be abandoned and that the Comanche will instead be pursued. Jack Hays has little choice. He indeed sees the value in seeking retribution, but his only option should he choose not to travel south with the Delaware will be to make his way back to San Antonio on foot, alone. In the end, there is little choice to be made. Hays joins the Delaware as they begin a dogged, sure-footed trot southwards through the sparse, rocky landscape in pursuit of the Comanche. The Delaware, with Hays in tow, keep up a slow but incessant jog that sees Hays tire after the first few hours. But the party carries on, without stopping for food or water until well into the night. Though he possesses formidable endurance, Hays is unused to this pace and duration of travel on foot. Soon, it is all he can do to match the footsteps of the Delaware warrior ahead of him as they plod southward. They stop only for minutes at a time, taking small bites of dried meat and resting briefly, before continuing on again. This withering pattern continues until noon the next day, when the party finally comes to rest at a freshwater spring. Here, they are able to finally drink their fill, and many of them lay down in the cool shade to sleep. Among these is Hays, who drops off into a deep sleep, thoroughly exhausted from the already monumental trek. In what seems like a fleeting few seconds, however, Hays is shaken awake. The sun has gone down, and the party is heading out, hitting the trail again at the same incessant trot. With little choice in the matter, Hays dutifully falls into line, again forcing himself to match the rhythm of the footsteps of the warrior ahead of him. For yet another night and day, the men travel on with the same routine. After resting on the second day, they again break camp, heading out into the moonlit night. Soon, however, they begin to smell the smoke of the campfires. Before long, the Delaware come to a halt and confer amongst themselves as to the exact plan of attack to be carried out upon the Comanche camp. It is decided that they will sneak into position inside of rifle range and ambush the Comanche at first light. The Delaware, with Hays following suit, begin to literally inch their way towards the Comanche camp, crawling forward on their bellies in barely perceptible intervals. After what seems to Hays like yet another eternity, the Delaware warrior next to him touches his shoulder, a silent signal that they need crawl no further. The party now watches and waits until sunrise. With the first few rays of morning light, the Delaware warriors and their Texas Ranger ally are ready. A signal is given to unleash a simultaneous volley into the Comanche camp, and while this initial volley sees only a few of the Comanche fall, the remainder of the camp is thrown into instant and abject chaos. The Comanche are unsure of exactly who is attacking them and of where the attack is coming from. Before this can be discerned, a second volley falls upon them, with more Comanche now falling to the ground, dead and dying, as their comrades scramble to mount a counterattack. Not wanting to afford their hated enemy the opportunity to mount their horses and escape, the Delaware warriors and Jack Hays now make a daring, on-foot charge into the center of the Comanche camp, wielding pistols, knives, and tomahawks, intent on slaughtering the Comanche in retribution for their fallen comrade. The fight that unfolds is brutal, with the Comanche being cut down, scalped, and mutilated wholesale. Though the Comanche do put up a formidable resistance, it is soon clear that their fight is lost. With this realization, many of the warriors now break camp and make a run for the Pecos River. Several are headed off before reaching the water, and several more are clubbed down in the rock-strewn shallows of the river. In his book, Texas Ranger, Jack Hays in the Frontier Southwest, author James Kimmons Greer sums up the fight thusly. The crunch of the light axe into skulls, or thrust of the long knife into backs of the Comanche warriors brought dying screams and gasps. Some of the swifter braves reached the stream safely. Many of them were shot in the water. Very few escaped. Their need for vengeance now satiated, the party cuts their hunting trip short, making their way back north, back to San Antonio. For the Delaware, the coming months and years would see them expelled from Texas, victims of newly elected Republic of Texas President Mirabeau Lamar's aggressive and indiscriminate policy of removing all native tribes from Texas lands. This would culminate in what would come to be known as the Cherokee Wars, in which numerous tribes would combat and ultimately fall to Lamar's radical policies. This would see them moved north into what was known as the Indian Territories, an area comprising the modern-day state of Oklahoma. They would again venture southward with the re-election of Sam Houston in 1841, as Houston had always made it a point to maintain his position as an ardent ally of the tribe. Many Delaware would serve in invaluable capacities as scouts for the Texas Rangers, as well as the U.S. Army, in conflicts ranging throughout Texas in the 19th century. Eventually, however, they would be permanently relegated to reservation lands in Oklahoma, where their official offices still reside today. For his part, Hayes would also go on to see far more action in fights against the Comanche, the Mexican Army, local bandits, even eventually going on to move west with the 1849 Gold Rush, becoming the first sheriff of San Francisco in 1850 and amassing a considerable land and cattle fortune in Northern California. Hayes would pass away in 1883, at the age of 66, in Piedmont, California. He is buried in the Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. This story, despite its scope and brutality, is but one of the countless accounts of bravery, vengeance, and violence on the Texas frontier in the 1800s that are too numerous to cover here in one episode. The many tales of the Comanche, the Delaware, the Texas Rangers, and the legendary Jack Hayes are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
(1831), somewhere in the Great Plains of the Dakotas, a band of Hunkpapa Lakotas celebrate the arrival of a newborn boy. The son of a warrior named Returned Again and his wife, her Holy Door. He is the apple of his parents' eye. The baby boy is named Jumping Badger. The Lakota, also known as the Sioux or the Teton Sioux, were a martial people whose itinerant lives were based on the buffalo herd's migration and warring with anyone who sought to stand between themselves and those herds. The Lakota are comprised of several bands: the Sikanju, the Oglala, the Itasipcho, the Hunkpapa, the Minikanju, the Hisapa, the Sihasapa, and the Uhinumpa. Though they possessed a few close allies throughout the years, including the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, their enemies were both numerous and vociferous. The Assiniboines, the Flatheads, the Hidatsas, and of course the U.S. Army were all hated enemies of the Lakota. This was largely due to the Lakota being relatively recent arrivals to the northern Great Plains, arriving sometime in the 18th century from the Great Lakes region. They had been encroaching on and taking over many other tribes' hunting lands and building a significant amount of animus towards themselves in the process. But perhaps the most hated enemy amongst the Lakota people were the Crow. Interviews of Lakota warriors taken well into the 20th century often denote their still vibrant, vitriolic hatred for the Crow, whom one described as the most cowardly tribe that ever lived. Safe to say, there was no love lost between the Lakota and the Crow. The young men, like all young Lakota, were taught to hate their enemies and to defend their families at all costs. This meant being proficient in all means of martial endeavors, from horsemanship to marksmanship to wrestling. Their mettle was tempered and tested through long exposure to sweat lodges in cold rivers, winter snows, and summer suns. But in conjunction to building their bodies, the young men also strengthened their minds and, of most importance in the Lakota worldview, their spirits. They were inspired by fireside stories of great warriors' deeds, of great conquest, capture, and selflessness. They edified their spirit and vision quests. As with young men everywhere, they spent the better part of their teens and early 20s yearning for an opportunity to make a name for themselves. In Lakota society, as was the case with most Plains tribes, the only means of social advancement for young men was via prowess in both hunting and warfare. And so it was for the young jumping badger, or as his friends and family often called him, Slow. The name was a result of the young man's deliberate and methodical nature, but, like his birth name, it wouldn't stick for too long. By the time he was 25, though more than a few accounts have this story occurring when he was as early as 14 years old, the young man had established himself as a hunter and was beginning to make a name for himself as a cunning horse thief. And the tribe with the most horses on the northern plains at that time were the Crow. This made them a powerful enemy and an enticing target. In his book Empire of the Summer Moon, also linked below, author S.C. Gwynn describes the stealing of horses on the open plains as the equivalent of instantaneous transmission of thousands of dollars into one's bank account. Thus, many a Lakota raid was undertaken against the Crow in an effort amongst young warriors to build both capital and prestige. When a group of young Lakota, including Slow and a number of his cohorts, set out to raid a Crow camp on the plains of what is today South Dakota. As they crested the low rise in the twilight of the morning sun, they spotted their quarry, a large group of horses, seemingly without a guard posted, as the Crow believed themselves too far out in remote country to worry about raiders or intruders. This was what the young Lakota had been hoping for. Silently, they made their way closer and closer to the Crow's horse herd. At a signal, the stampede was started, and as many horses as could be taken in one fell swoop were driven away from the Crow village and northwest onto the open prairie. But now, the Crow were alerted. Now, the element of surprise had been rapidly, if predictably, disintegrated, and the Lakota were on the defensive. As often happened in these situations, a running fight ensued over rolling prairie land until, eventually, the Lakota managed to ensconce themselves in a defensive redoubt in a narrow ravine. The Crow pinned them down, intent on making these Lakota interlopers pay immortal tolls for their intrusion and intentions. At first, they rained down bullets and arrows upon the position, but finding the Lakota had procured themselves sufficient cover, they quickly found themselves mired in a stalemate. The two parties quickly found themselves mired in a stalemate. From their defensive positions, hunkered down behind rocks and logs deep in the ravine, the young, anxious Lakota warriors debated their next course of action. Escape was impossible, but so was an outright victory. And even if they could flee, what was the point in going home at all if it was without any of the horses they had stolen and with no enemy scalps to show? The debate raged intensely, but briefly, as one among them proposed his own solution. He would go out alone, he said, and challenge the Crow chief to a one-on-one fight. This was a time-honored means of intertribal conflict on the plains, and often a means through which a larger-scale conflict could be avoided via them playing out in individual combats. But obviously, these were very high stakes for the combatants involved. But the young man, perhaps now showing the virtue behind his supposed vice, was cool and even-tempered throughout. He took up his thick buffalo hide shield that could not only deflect bullets when held at the right angle, but also carried, he believed, a powerful protective medicine. In his other hand, he took up his single-shot musket. These were smooth-bore weapons, and though outdated, still highly prized amongst the tribes for the physical effects they could wreak and the psychological trauma that they could inflict. The young warrior strode confidently out from his defensive position, seemingly unfazed by the prospect of enemy fire. He called out in a loud, clear, and confident tone that he was challenging the Crow chief to a one-on-one fight, to the death, right here, right now. The Crow chief then strode out from amongst his men, also with a thick buffalo hide shield and a musket. He called out to the young, haughty horse thief that not only would he not be going home with any Crow horses today, he would not be going home at all. Now, the Crow chief said, he was going to kill him. Both men started in a militant trot towards one another, their comrades and charges waiting pensively behind them. As he ran, the Lakota, who was known to have a fine, clear, high-pitched singing voice, sang his death song. "My trials are many, but my life is short." First to break step was the Crow chief, who, when the two were a few dozen yards away, quickly dropped to one knee, steadied his aim, and fired in one deft motion. The young Sioux warrior, now perhaps making some of his comrades behind him second-guess the propriety of his slightly derisive nickname, the Slow, managed to angle his shield down so that the musket ball ricocheted off of it and down towards the ground. However, before smashing into terra firma, the lead ball tore into the young Lakota's foot. It was a ghastly wound that would have rendered most combat ineffective, but the young man's countenance seemed unchanged, despite the blood pouring from his foot into the prairie dirt. His eyes seemed never to waver from his intended target, as once the Crow's musket had been fired, he now had time to stop and take aim for his own shot. As the Crow chief rapidly closed the distance, knife in hand, the young Lakota coolly took aim, waited until the Crow was but a few paces away, and deftly put a musket ball into his torso. The Crow went down hard, writhing in agony from the internal, irreversible damage done by the lead ball. However, he would not have to suffer long. Without hesitating, the Lakota hobbled as fast as he could on his badly injured and profusely bleeding foot to the side of his disabled enemy. Here, he quickly unsheathed his hunting knife and plunged it directly into the still-beating heart of the Crow chief. As the chief let loose his death rattle, the Lakota cut slits in the skin above his ears, then around the back of the Crow's head, and then the sides, and then finally the forehead. And after a few vigorous, violent tugs, he managed to wrest the bloody scalp from its previous owner and thus cement his reputation as a new warrior amongst his people. The Lakota present all made their way, Crow horses in tow, back to their home camp, where the young Slow was greeted as a conquering hero and fearless new warrior. The curious nature and fastidious disposition that had often seemed so perplexing to his people had now blossomed into not only a formidable fighter, but a trustworthy leader, and eventually as a kind of holy man, whose visions and premonitions would hold great sway amongst his people. In his life, he would go on to meet presidents and royalty, tour Europe, stay in some of New York's finest hotels, lead some of the bloodiest battles the northern plains would ever see, and ultimately die a martyr's death on a lonely, frozen prairie. The Lakota would know him Tatanka Hyotake, but you most likely know him as Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull would go on to be one of the most seminal figures in American history, and participate in countless more legendary raids and battles, including the legendary Battle of the Little Bighorn. And while those episodes are indeed coming soon, very soon, for tonight, those are other stories for other times.
Late fall, 1837, somewhere on the plains of Kansas. As the autumn wind cut through the prairie grass, its haunting melody decrying the harsh winter to come, a Cheyenne war chief named Porcupine Bear made his way from village to village, carrying a message that was part sorrowful lamentation and part vociferous call to arms. He was the leader of the Dogmen, one of the Cheyenne's vaunted warrior societies, and his aim was to marshal forces to exact revenge for an incident months earlier in which 42 of his brethren had been massacred by the Cheyenne's most hated enemies, the Kiowa and the Comanche. Porcupine Bear's task was not as easy as one might imagine, as the practical problems of a harsh oncoming winter that the tribe would have to survive with 42 newly fatherless families, combined with the widespread grief of the occurrence of such a tragedy, posed at least momentarily insurmountable obstacles to any plans of immediate exacting of revenge. But Porcupine Bear's cries were not falling entirely on deaf ears, especially amongst the younger men in the tribe's camps scattered about Kansas, Montana, and Colorado. Porcupine Bear's calls for action were enthusiastically received amongst this crowd. Then, Porcupine Bear stopped to visit family who lived with a band that he did not often see. There, he and his family members got drunk on rot-cut whiskey
and Porcupine Bear's cousin became involved in an argument with another member of the band. Their words soon turned into a brawl, and the young men grappled about the camp, each trying to take down his adversary and begin landing punches. The opponent managed to take down Porcupine Bear's cousin and commenced landing blows at will. As all this happened, Porcupine Bear set off to the side, alone, contentedly enjoying his buzz and singing his personal war songs. Then, his cousin began to cry out, beseeching the war chief for help to save him from his current travails. So, seemingly unaffectedly, Porcupine Bear stood up, drew his knife, walked over to the tussling young warriors, and stabbed his cousin's aggressor in the ribs. He then called on his family present to come forth and help him kill this no-good ruffian who had the audacity to assault a member of their bloodline. This they did, and the young man was summarily stabbed to death in the middle of the camp. Now, though Plains tribes did not exactly have stratified official forms of legal justice, this did not mean that crimes were left unchecked, even those committed by vaunted and popular war chiefs like Porcupine Bear. A council was held amongst the elder chiefs, and it was summarily decided that Porcupine Bear, his family, and anyone who did not sever their allegiance to his dog soldier society were to be henceforth banished from the tribe. So, Porcupine Bear, his family, and a small group of a few dozen followers left their home camp, bound for the open prairie where they would start anew, away from the official bands of the Cheyenne tribe. But just because the Cheyenne were now out of sight did not mean that they were out of Porcupine Bear's mind. While the elder Cheyenne chiefs had failed to take action in the initiating of any kind of retributive raid on the Kiowa and Comanche, their war chiefs had convinced the tribe as a whole that it was now time to move south, towards the known campsites of the Kiowa and Comanche on what is now Wolf's Creek in northwestern Oklahoma. As they moved south, they joined forces with their longtime allies and often inseparable comrades, the Arapaho. The Kiowa and Comanche had been long hated by the Arapaho, and any chance at exacting a toll on them was eagerly pounced upon by their young warriors. Shadowing this large contingent of Cheyenne and Arapaho, keeping well out of sight but always abreast of the situation, was Porcupine Bear and his outlaw band of die-hard dog soldiers. Officially recognized or not, he was determined to get his revenge on the Kiowa and Comanche. After a harrowing trek south in which the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Porcupine Bear's band almost succumbed to starvation numerous times, the loose contingent came to camp within a dozen miles or so of each other. It was now early spring 1838. From here, they would make ready for the final movement to attack the Kiowa and Comanche camp. It was well known to the main Cheyenne and Arapaho contingents that the band of outlaws were present, and fully intending on taking part in the raid on the Kiowa and Comanche. However, in this case, they were tolerated due to their martial prowess and because it was largely agreed that, in spite of his crimes against his tribal brother, Porcupine Bear was due his vengeance in Kiowa and Comanche blood, as he had lost many friends and family in their massacring of the Bowstring Society. The night before the attack on the Kiowa and Comanche camp, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Porcupine Bear's outlaw band made ready in their respective camps. The women prepared all of their belongings for a speedy flight should the worst happen and all their men be killed and they be made to run. The men, meanwhile, painting themselves and their horses, checked their weapons and sang their war songs quietly. Then, in 3 separate contingents, they headed south towards the Comanche and Kiowa camp. The Cheyenne headed due south, seeking to make contact with the Kiowas camped on the north side of Wolf's Creek. The Arapaho, a few miles away, headed to cut off the Comanche retreat on the south side of the creek. Porcupine Bear and his lot headed due south just a little farther west of the Cheyenne's main band in search of any Kiowa or Comanche they might find and be able to kill. They would all cover roughly 30 miles in the pre-dawn hours, but the main bodies of the Cheyenne and Arapaho would just slightly miss their intended destinations. They had left their women and children a few miles away, made an initial sweep into the territory with their scouts and found themselves just east of the Kiowa on the northern bank of the Wolf's Creek. This would delay their first contact beyond the dawn attack that they had intended, and left Porcupine Bear and his band well to the west of them to their own devices. Porcupine Bear and his experienced dog soldiers had not missed their target, and their scouts had spotted a band of about 30 Kiowa warriors and their wives who had gone out on an early morning buffalo hunt. Porcupine Bear directed his warriors to conceal themselves behind a ridge. He took off his feathered headdress, styled in an aggressively expansive fashion of the dog soldiers, and threw down his weapons. He mounted his horse and rode back and forth along the ridge, making signs for the Kiowas that he had seen buffalo. The Kiowa men and women, believing him from this distance and in the dim light of morning to be a member of their own band, came towards him. Just as they drew close, Porcupine Bear rode over the ridge, beckoning them all the while to follow his lead without ever turning his face towards them so as to conceal his identity even at close range. Finally, Porcupine Bear urged his horse forward and galloped out of sight of the Kiowas down into the ravine in which his fellow dog soldiers waited, their arrows nocked and lances at the ready. He told them to be ready, for in moments their opportunity would come, and they must not waste it. And so, the opportunity came. As the 30 unsuspecting Kiowa crested the ridge, excitedly expecting to be led to a large herd of buffalo, they, instead, came face to face with dozens of dog soldiers, adorned in their feathered headdresses, black and white war paint, with their weapons readied and their hearts burning for vengeance. Before the Kiowa could even draw their bows from their cases, the Cheyenne were upon them. They showered their arrows upon them with such great rapidity and accuracy that within moments, every fortunate Kiowa lay dead. The unfortunate were summarily bludgeoned, lanced, or slashed to death, men and women alike. The last Kiowa man to arrive on the scene had time to turn his horse and make a run for his life, but his wife cried out to him, begging him not to leave her here to die. With the most valiant of intentions, the Kiowa rushed back into the fray in an attempt to save his wife, but both were quickly, ruthlessly cut down. Soon, 30 Kiowa bodies lay dead on the Oklahoma prairie, and as the morning sun rose to its full glory, Porcupine Bear stood covered in the blood of 12 different people that he had been witness to have either shot, stabbed, or bludgeoned to death. The horses of the dead were all rounded up, and the dead were summarily stripped of all their belongings. However, they were not scalped. Though an outlaw band, these dog soldiers still recognized the laws of honor, and, as they had been directed by the head chiefs of the Cheyenne that they were not to count any coup or take any scalps, they deferred to this authority. Besides, for this band of experienced soldiers who had lost much to their enemies, their interest was not in trophies nor in counting coup. They had come here to kill Kiowa, and this they had done. But the day had just begun. This raid on the Kiowa and Comanche camp would turn into the largest known and last great battle between the largest tribes of the southern plains. Fighting would rage well into the night, and hundreds of lives would be lost. It would be known to history as the Battle of Wolf's Creek, and showcase some of the most brutal fighting and most ruthless warfare ever recorded between warring tribes. The Kiowa would lose many of their best warriors, as would the Comanche. Many women and children would fall to the Cheyenne and Arapaho lances, arrows, and clubs. Many Cheyenne and Arapaho would also fall, including several highly respected chiefs. Some warriors who had predicted their own demise in stark and startling detail, such as the Cheyenne Flat Club, would be proven nearly prophetic in their foretellings. And to be sure, the Battle of Wolf's Creek is going to be an ongoing series here on HOKC, complete with its own playlist linked below. However, for tonight, those are other stories for other times. (1878) Texas Hill Country. On a lazy, hot Texas afternoon, a band of Comanche had staked their sprawling camp near a creek that afforded some water and shade. They had been leisurely moving about the territory for a few weeks now, killing and eating what buffalo they could find, and killing a buffalo hunter here and there for fun. Earlier that day, 6 of their young braves had ventured off in search of game. All of a sudden, 3 of them appeared on the horizon. Now, not only were they 3 members short, before they were even able to broach the perimeter of the camp, they began to cry out the terrible news. The missing 3 braves had all been killed, cut down in a surprise attack by a roving band of about 30 Tonkawa warriors. The Tonkawa had long occupied central Texas, and had endured many hardships and much violence at the hand of the Comanche, as the Comanche had endured from them. Over the years, disdain had devolved into outright hatred, and atrocities on both sides were numerous and severe by any measure. The Comanche warriors, enraged at the murder of their friends and kinsmen, immediately grabbed their weapons and supplies, mounted their horses, and were off in pursuit. And after about 3 hours following the trail of the Tonkawa, they crested a ridge and came within sight of their camp. The Tonkawas, seemingly under the impression they had fled beyond the reasonable bounds of enemy pursuit, sat around a campfire waiting for their evening meal to cook. Then, for a fleeting moment, as the Comanche party came within sight of the Tonkawa, and the Tonkawa looked towards the top of the ridge that loomed over their camp and noticed their pursuers, there was a stark, terrifying silence. Then, the Comanche war chief gave a piercing war cry, and the band of Comanche swooped down into the ravine in which the Tonkawa were camped. Several Tonkawa were cut down in the camp, and the survivors fled deeper into the ravine. The Comanche now had possession of the camp. They scalped the Tonkawa who had been killed and began to ransack the possessions that had been left. Then, one warrior inspected the campfire that was still burning, with the Tonkawa's meal still sizzling. He shrieked out a war cry as he recognized the roasting meat that the Tonkawa had been preparing was a human leg. The Tonkawa practiced ritual cannibalism on all of their enemies, especially the hated Comanche, and this practice of imposed posthumous indignity ignited a unique ire within the Comanche. Now, killing their enemy alone would not do. The Comanche were determined to exact their pound of proverbial flesh and more. All present mounted again and took off down the ravine in hot pursuit of their quarry, now with their bloodlust unfettered. In the intervening time between their flight and the Comanche's gruesome discovery, the Tonkawa had constructed a defensive position deep in the ravine. From here, as they took on the initial Comanche charge, they managed to lay down a formidable amount of fire and fall several of their attackers. This managed to pause the Comanche onslaught. Then, a Tonkawa brave rode out of the ravine towards the Comanche. Raising his shield, he called out to them, challenging any among them to individual combat. One Comanche rode forward and was killed in hand-to-hand combat with the Tonkawa. Another charged forward and met the same fate. The Tonkawa believed eating the flesh of their enemy would imbue them with the desirable characteristics of that said fallen foe. The speculation in the Comanche ranks was that the taste of human flesh had made this Tonkawa particularly bold and powerful. Finally, a third Comanche managed to ride forward and dispatch him. At this point, the natural apprehension towards attacking an entrenched position gave way to collective rage. A war cry went up from the Comanches, who now sensed their prey within reach, and they made a final mad dash charge in which the remaining Tonkawas were either killed or mortally wounded in hand-to-hand combat. By the end of the fight, 8 more Comanche were killed and 40 to 50 more badly wounded. It had been a costly victory, but now the Comanche would truly exact their retribution. The following is Herman Lehman's personal account of the events that came next. A great many of the dying enemy were gasping for water, but we heeded not their pleadings. We scalped them, amputated their arms, cut off their legs, cut out their tongues, and threw their mangled bodies and limbs upon their own campfire, put on more brushwood, and piled the living, dying, and dead Tonkawas onto the fire. Some of them were able to flinch and work as a worm, and some were able to speak and plead for mercy. We piled them up, put on more wood, and danced around in great glee as we saw the grease and blood run from their bodies, and were delighted to see them swell up and hear the hide pop as it would burst in the fire. When all the Tonkawas had been consumed in the flames, the Comanche returned to their camp to find a scene of great sadness and despair. The wives of the slain men wept and moaned loudly and cut deep gashes into their arms, faces, and bodies. A somber and solemn funeral ritual was undertaken, and it would be 3 months more before the warriors would even attempt to raid again. After all the rage had settled, it seemed there was only endless amounts of pain and grief to be suffered. Though victory had gone to the Comanches, both sides were greatly impacted. Tonight's story is not to illustrate the particular culpability or competence of either side, but to give you a view into the world that is all too often misunderstood and ultimately underappreciated. There are thousands more tales of intertribal conflict, but for now, those are other stories for other times.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.